Welcome to the podcast. I hope you enjoy my stories. Today's episode is Life Signs by James Byron Love. Copyright 2026. All rights reserved. Now let's get into this dark humor sci-fi story.
The exosuit smelled like someone had stored industrial lubricant in it for the better part of a decade, which, as it turned out, someone almost certainly had. A fact that Zuillda had noted in item 3 of his pre-deployment checklist, along with 16 other items he had flagged as requiring attention, correction, or at minimum acknowledgement before he was expected to climb inside the thing and allow it to seal around him like a very expensive and aggressively unpleasant second skin. None of the 17 items had been addressed. Not one's. The lubricant smell had, if anything, intensified once the suit pressurized, suggesting that heat was interacting with whatever residual compound had been left in the lining in ways that Zuillda's atmospheric sensors could quantify, but that his dignity preferred not to. He stood in the deployment bay of the Meridian threshold and looked at himself in the reflective access panel beside the airlock, and the thing that looked back at him was not, by any reasonable definition of the word, a person in a suit. It was approximately 3.8 meters tall. It had 4 primary limb assemblies arranged in a configuration that suggested the designer had been working from a description of a living creature rather than any direct observation of one, and 2 secondary manipulator appendages that extended from the thoracic housing at angles that communicated, very clearly, that no joint in any known biology had ever moved that way by choice. The head unit in Zuillda applied the term with the generosity of a man who had run out of more accurate ones, was a blunt ovoid sensor cluster that sat atop the main chassis with the architectural confidence of something that had been placed there last, after everything else was already done, by someone who had only just remembered that sensor clusters needed somewhere to go. The overall silhouette, when Zuillda shifted his weight experimentally to test the hip actuators, produced a sound that fell somewhere between a hydraulic system, expressing profound mechanical doubt, and a large animal making the particular noise animals make when something has gone very wrong for them personally. "Suit systems," said Voss, from the comm channel with the focused professional energy of someone reading the ingredients off a food container, "are reading nominal across all primary functions, so you're clear for deployment on schedule, and there's nothing in the telemetry that should give you any reason for concern." "I would like to discuss," Zuillda said, still looking at the reflective panel with the expression of a man whose face the suit could not display but whose tone carried the full weight of it, "the baseline against which you are measuring nominal, because I have several questions about what that word means in this specific context, and whether the people who designed this suit's calibration profile were working from the same definition. The baseline is that it's on, the life support is functioning within acceptable parameters, the shield array is showing green across the board, and you're not dead, which in the broader spectrum of possible suit conditions is actually a pretty solid position to be in when you're 40 minutes from a planetary drop," Voss said, in the tone of someone who felt this was a reasonable and complete answer to the question that had been asked. "Voss, that is the minimum possible threshold for a suit being considered operational, and I want it noted that describing the minimum possible threshold as nominal is a linguistic choice that concerns me on a number of levels, not least of which is that it suggests the people responsible for my equipment have defined their success criteria at the precise point where the equipment has not yet killed me, which is a standard I personally would like to see set somewhat higher," Zuillda said, turning slightly so he could see the suit's profile from a different angle, which did not improve matters. The exosuit was, according to its specification documents, a Class 4 biological mimicry unit, purpose-built to render the wearer visually consistent with the dominant life forms of whatever planetary environment they were being deployed into, which was a reasonable and genuinely useful piece of technology when the dominant life forms in question were something a mimicry unit could actually mimic. According to MEC-Catalogue 7 Theta 9's official survey classification, the dominant life forms of the target planet were non-motile colonial cellular clusters with no observable complex behavioral repertoire, which meant the suit had been calibrated for a planet where the most sophisticated organism present was unlikely to look at it and form anything resembling an opinion. What Zuillda was looking at in the panel, and what any organism above the threshold of basic photosensitivity would look at and immediately form an opinion about, was not something that suggested colonial microorganism. It suggested, quite forcefully, something that colonial microorganisms would be correct to flee from if they had the locomotive capacity to do so, which according to the survey they did not, which was the only mercy available in the entire situation. Zuillda said, addressing the primary comm channel with the careful diction of a man constructing a sentence that needed to carry a significant amount of weight without collapsing under it. I need you to tell me, in your own words, and with whatever level of detail you feel is appropriate, what the reasoning was behind assigning a Class 4 mimicry unit to a planetary assessment, where the survey classification indicates there is nothing on the surface capable of perceiving visual mimicry as a relevant adaptive strategy. Drex, who was the Threshold's operations lead, and who had, in the 2 weeks since Zuillda had come aboard, demonstrated a consistent and apparently effortless ability to treat every professional concern Zuillda raised as a form of entertainment specifically produced for his benefit, took a moment before responding that carried the particular quality of someone settling more comfortably into their seat. The way I understand the equipment allocation process, and I want to be upfront that I'm not an equipment allocation specialist, and you should weight my answer accordingly, is that when a planetary drop gets scheduled, the deployment coordinator pulls from whatever inventory is available at the time the order gets filed, and what was available when your drop got filed was the Class 4 unit you're currently standing in, and the thinking, as best I can reconstruct it, was probably that a mimicry unit on a sub-sentient biological classification planet is essentially irrelevant anyway since there's nothing there to fool, so it didn't much matter what kind of unit went down as long as it had the right atmospheric tolerances and shield ratings, which yours does, Drex said, and then added, after a brief pause that had the texture of someone deciding whether to include the next part, also I think the Class 2 units were all out for maintenance. The Class 2 units were out for maintenance, Zuillda repeated. That's my understanding, yes. So the reasoning was that since there is theoretically nothing on this planet capable of observing me, it doesn't matter what I look like when I'm down there, and therefore any available suit regardless of its visual profile was considered an acceptable deployment option, Zuillda said, articulating the logic precisely, and completely so that its full shape was visible to everyone on the channel. That is a pretty accurate summary of how I understand the decision, yes, Drex said. And nobody considered the possibility that the survey might be wrong, Zuillda said. There was a pause that had a different quality to it than the pauses that had come before it, a slightly more careful quality, the quality of a pause that was aware it was being listened to. The survey, said Caleb, the Threshold's mission coordinator, entering the conversation with the measured tread of a man who had learned to treat every sentence as a potential liability, has been on file with MEC Regional Operations for 41 years, and has formed the legal and operational basis for the entire 7 Theta 9 acquisition chain. And while I understand that you may have questions about specific methodological elements of the original documentation, the classification itself has been reviewed and confirmed at the regional operations level and represents MEC's official position on the planetary biological profile, which is the position that this deployment has been planned and authorized against. Caleb, that is a very thorough explanation of why the survey exists and what it has been used for, and I appreciate the detail, but I notice it doesn't actually address the question of whether anyone considered the possibility that it might be wrong, Zuillda said. Surveys filed with MEC regional operations are considered accurate until formally contested through the standard review process, Caleb said, with the serenity of a man who had located his footing on solid procedural ground and intended to remain there. I would like to begin that process, Zuillda said. The formal contest review process requires a minimum of 90 days from initial filing and cannot be initiated retroactively against an active deployment authorization, Caleb said, and there was in his voice the faintest ghost of something that was not quite satisfaction, but was adjacent to it, the tone of a man who had known this question was coming and had prepared the answer in advance. So what you're telling me, Zuillda said, turning back to look at the reflective panel and the thing in it that looked like something a planetary ecosystem would generate antibodies against, is that I am going into that planet in this suit, against a survey I have professional reservations about, on a timeline that does not allow for the review process that would resolve those reservations, and that all of this is entirely consistent with MEC operational procedure. That is correct, said Caleb. I want that in writing, Zuillda said. I'll send you the relevant procedure codes, Caleb said. I want it in writing from a person, Caleb, not a procedure code. I want a sentence, authored by a human being with a name attached to it, that says Zuillda was deployed under these specific conditions, and MEC considers those conditions to have been appropriate and within standard operating parameters. The silence that followed this request was long enough, and had enough texture to it that Zuillda could distinguish at least 3 different people on the channel choosing not to speak, which was itself a form of answer. This assignment had arrived in Zuillda's life in the specific way that assignments arrive when the universe has decided that a person's recent run of adequate luck has gone on long enough and requires balancing. He had been at Junction Station 14 on a 12-day layover between standard assessment rotations, occupying a station-side berth that smelled only marginally better than the suit currently smelled, when MEC's regional coordinator had sent him a deployment offer structured with the grammatical form of a choice and the practical substance of a fait accompli. The Meridian threshold was 3 weeks out from a Class 7 minerals assessment on a catalogued acquisition target and had lost its field assessor to a medical evacuation. The previous assessor, a man named Prek whose professional judgment Zuillda was already retrospectively revising upward to levels approaching admiration, had been removed from the ship at Junction Station 14 with what the briefing notes described as a bilateral joint inflammation issue of sufficient severity to require specialist facility care, which Zuillda had initially read as a straightforward medical situation and was now reconsidering in light of everything he had subsequently learned about the assignment, because bilateral joint inflammation was also, he reflected, a reasonable physical response to being shown the exosuit and told to get in it. The offer had come with a Class 7 performance bonus attached, which was the kind of bonus MEC reserved for assignments they knew were going to require compensation specifically for the act of agreeing to them, and which should have functioned as a clear and unambiguous signal that the assignment in question was the sort of thing sensible people declined. Zuillda had taken it because the alternative was 3 more days at Junction Station 14, which had all the warmth and charm of a municipal processing facility that had decided aesthetics were an unnecessary expense, and because the bonus was genuinely substantial, and because he had not yet seen the suit. He had now seen the suit, and he was filing the memory of how attractive the bonus had seemed at the time under lessons that had been expensive to learn. 6 minutes to deployment window, Voss said, with the cheerful efficiency of someone who had no personal stake in what happened during the deployment window. I need to register, Zuillda said, pulling up the survey documentation on his internal display and scrolling through it with the focused attention of a professional who was already preparing the vocabulary for what he was looking at, a formal pre-deployment concern notation regarding the original biological assessment for MEC-Catalogue 7 Theta 9. Specifically regarding the methodology used to establish the sub-sentient classification that forms the basis for the current operational parameters, because I have reviewed the survey document in its entirety, and I have questions about the data that I believe are material to this deployment. You can file a concern notation through the standard post-mission documentation process, Caleb said immediately, with the reflexive smoothness of a man who had spent his career redirecting concerns into processes where they could be managed at a safe distance from the present moment. My concern is pre-mission in nature, Caleb, which I would think is evident from the fact that I'm raising it before the mission rather than after it. And the reason I'm raising it before the mission is that post-mission documentation has a certain limitation in that it requires there to be a post-mission, which I would like to improve the odds of by addressing my concerns now, while I still have the option of not getting into a drop pod, Zuillda said. And then without waiting for Caleb to redirect him again, he continued, the biological survey section of the 7 Theta 9 documentation is 3 paragraphs long, cites a single orbital observation event as its primary and apparently sole data source, contains 4 atmospheric sampling data points for an entire planetary atmosphere, and was produced by a contractor survey team whose methodology section describes their approach as a rapid classification pass, which is a phrase I have not previously encountered in any survey documentation I have reviewed in 14 years of field assessment work, and which I would very much like someone to explain to me. There was a quality to the silence that followed this that was different from the careful silences that had come before it. This one had more people in it, all of them apparently deciding simultaneously that speaking first was not in their interest. Voss, Zuillda said, since Voss was the least likely to have a procedural objection to answering a direct question, when you pulled the survey methodology data earlier, did the documentation specify what velocity the orbital observation pass was conducted at? It did, yes, Voss said, in the tone of someone confirming a fact they would have preferred not to be the one confirming. And that velocity was warp 6, Zuillda said. That is what the documentation indicates, Voss agreed. So the entire biological classification for this planet, the classification that determined what kind of life forms I should expect to encounter, what kind of suit was considered appropriate for this deployment, and what the operational parameters for this entire mission are based on, was established by a team that flew past the planet at Warp 6, pointed their sensors at it for however long a Warp 6 transit of a planetary body takes, and wrote 3 paragraphs about what they thought they saw. Zuillda said, assembling the picture piece by piece and presenting it to the channel fully assembled so nobody could claim they hadn't seen it. When you phrase it like that, Drex said, with the tone of a man genuinely engaging with the framing rather than dismissing it, it does sound like maybe the survey process had some room for improvement, but I want to offer a counterpoint, which is that whoever did it clearly felt strongly enough about their methodology to put their name on the documentation and file it with MEC Regional. And MEC Regional accepted it and built an acquisition case around it, and that acquisition case has been standing for 41 years without anyone contesting it, which suggests that either the survey was good enough for the purposes it was used for, or that nobody looked at it closely enough to notice it wasn't, and either way here we are and you're going in the suit. That counterpoint, Zuillda said, contains within it at least 2 scenarios that I find significantly more alarming than the original concern it was offered to address. 4 minutes, said Voss. Zuillda looked at the suit in the panel. The suit looked back at him with its blunt sensor cluster in the way that things look back when they have no capacity for self-awareness, and therefore no appreciation of how bad they look. It made the hydraulic noise again, unprompted, as if registering its own pre-deployment complaint, which was the first time since coming aboard the threshold that Zuillda had felt any kinship with a piece of equipment. I am going to complete this deployment, Zuillda said, moving toward the drop pod access with the measured stride of a professional who had accepted the situation without agreeing that the situation was acceptable, and I am going to conduct a thorough and complete assessment of MEC-Catalogue 7-Theta-9 to the full standard required by my contract and by Galactic Survey Protocol. And I am going to document everything I find with complete accuracy and in full compliance with all applicable reporting requirements. And when I am done, I am going to file the most comprehensive and meticulously sourced pre-deployment concern notation in the history of MEC's Regional Operations Division. And I want everyone on this channel to know that I consider that notation to be a living document that I will be adding to throughout the course of this deployment. We'll look forward to reading it, Drex said. I'm serious, Drex. I know you are, which is honestly what makes it so good, Drex said, and there was the muffled sound of Voss laughing in the background before the channel adjusted its gain. The drop pod sealed around Zuillda with a series of mechanical confirmations that his suit systems logged as nominal, by the standard that Voss had earlier established for that word, and the deployment sequence initiated, and the Meridian threshold released him into the atmosphere of MEC-Catalogue 7-Theta-9 with the casual efficiency of a ship that had done this many times before and had no particular emotional investment in the outcome of this specific instance of it. The descent was unremarkable from a technical standpoint. The atmospheric entry data was consistent with a standard Class M profile nitrogen-oxygen mix with a slightly elevated carbon dioxide ratio that his suit flagged for notation, standard pressure gradient, nothing that contradicted a habitable world in any concerning way. Zuillda cataloged it all with the automatic professional thoroughness of a man who had been doing this long enough that the data collection ran independently of whatever else he was thinking about, and what he was thinking about was the survey, and what the survey had said, and what was presently coming into resolution through the pod's forward imaging array. He had been expecting, on the basis of the survey, to land in the middle of a biologically quiet landscape of simple organisms and uncomplicated geology, the kind of planetary surface that asked nothing of you and offered nothing back, the professional equivalent of an empty room that needed measuring. What the forward imaging array was showing him, with a resolution that increased in clarity and specificity the closer he got to the surface, was not that. It was a forest, which was fine. Forests were within the expected parameters of a Class M world regardless of biological complexity. The forest was not the problem. The forest ended at a defined boundary, and the defined boundary was defined by something that the imaging array's terrain analysis software, which had been calibrated for natural geological features, was having a mild processing difficulty with because it was not a geological feature. It was straight. It was very deliberately straight, in the way that things are straight when something with intentionality and the capacity to execute on it, has decided that straight is what they want. It was a road. Threshold, Zuillda said, in a voice that was entirely level and professional and gave nothing away. I am completing my descent approach on 7 Theta 9, and I am observing, through the forward imaging array, what my terrain analysis software is currently categorizing as an anomalous linear surface feature of approximately 4.2 meters width, exhibiting a consistent compacted mineral substrate profile and a regularity of form that does not appear consistent with natural geological processes, and I would like to formally note this observation as my first pre-landing data point of interest. Say again, said Caleb. There is a road, Caleb, Zuillda said, because sometimes the scientific register needed a rest. There is a road and there is something on it, and whatever is on it is moving under what appears to be directed mechanical propulsion, and I want the survey documentation for this planet pulled up and queued, because I think we are going to be spending some time with it very shortly. The pod hit the tree line and Zuillda engaged the landing sequence and the forest closed around him, and the last thing the forward array captured before the canopy obscured it was the road, and the thing on it, and behind the thing on it, at a distance that suggested a settlement of some size, the angular profiles of structures that had not grown there. Zuillda stood at the edge of the tree line and took a moment to appreciate, in the purely clinical way that professionals appreciate things that are actively making their lives worse, the full scope of what he was looking at. The settlement, and there was no other word for it that his professional vocabulary would honestly support, though he was going to use better words than that in his formal documentation, spread out ahead of him across a gently sloping landscape with the unhurried confidence of something that had been there for a long time and fully expected to continue being there. The structures were constructed from processed mineral and timber materials, arranged along a grid pattern that spoke to deliberate planning rather than organic growth, and the road that had caught his attention on the way down ran straight through the middle of it like a spine, with smaller subsidiary pathways branching off it at regular intervals in both directions. Threshold, Zuillda said, keeping his voice at the measured register he reserved for field reporting, which was to say the register he used when the data he was filing was going to cause problems for someone, and he wanted the record to reflect that he had delivered it calmly and professionally. I am conducting initial visual and sensor assessment of what I am formally logging as an artificial settlement structure of significant scale. Located at the primary coordinates for today's geological survey transect, and I want to note for the record that the geological survey transect is going to need to be rescheduled because there is a settlement on top of it, and settlements, in my professional experience, complicate core sample extraction in ways that the original mission timeline does not appear to have accounted for. How big a settlement are we talking about? Said Voss, with what sounded like genuine curiosity, which was a tone Voss did not deploy often enough for Zuillda to have become comfortable with it. My initial visual estimate, which I am going to refine considerably as I get better sensor coverage, is that the settlement covers an area of approximately 4 square kilometers of developed surface, with structural density suggesting a permanent residential and commercial population of somewhere between 15 and 30,000 individual entities. And I want to emphasize the word permanent because the construction methods and material weathering profiles I am observing are not consistent with temporary or seasonal occupation. These structures have been here for a long time, and they have been maintained and expanded, and in several cases rebuilt. And the overall impression is of a community that has absolutely no idea it is sitting on top of MEC's geological survey coordinates, and would probably have something to say about it if it did. Zuillda said and then paused to let that sit for a moment before adding, also there are more of the combustion drive conveyances on the road, and I am observing what appears to be pedestrian traffic on the subsidiary pathways, which means the entities that built this place are currently using it and are therefore present, which is relevant to my approach strategy. The comm channel was quiet in a way that was different from its usual quality of quiet, which was typically the quiet of people not paying attention, and was now the quiet of people paying very close attention and not yet having decided what to say about what they were hearing. Caleb, said Drex, and there was in his voice the first faint trace of something that was not quite amusement and not quite concern, but existed in the territory between them. I think our boy down there might be describing people. I am describing entities of unknown classification, whose biological and cognitive profiles I have not yet had sufficient opportunity to assess in the detail required by Galactic Survey Protocol, and I would appreciate it if we did not get ahead of the data, Zuillda said, though he was aware as he said it that he was being more cautious than the data actually warranted, because the entities he could see moving along the subsidiary pathways were walking upright on two limbs, using the other two for carrying objects and gesturing at one another, and were doing all of this with the purposeful and coordinated ease of creatures who had been doing it their entire lives, and expected to continue doing it indefinitely without anyone dropping out of the sky and complicating things. I am going to attempt to move through the settlement periphery while maintaining a low observational profile, Zuillda said, in order to collect the biological and geological data required by the mission parameters, and I want to flag that the exosuit's current visual profile may present some challenges to the low observational profile objective. And I am formally noting that this is a direct consequence of the equipment allocation decision that was made prior to my deployment, and which I registered a concern about before leaving the ship. Your concern is noted and remains on file, Caleb said. Thank you, Caleb, that is very reassuring, Zuillda said, in a tone that indicated it was not reassuring at all, and he stepped out of the tree line and began moving along the settlement's outer edge with the careful deliberateness of something very large trying to be invisible, which was a project that the laws of physics were not prepared to support. The first 30 meters went better than they had any right to. The outer edge of the settlement in this section was primarily agricultural in character, with cultivated land parcels separated by low boundary markers and a relative absence of the pedestrian traffic he had observed further in, and he moved along the boundary of the nearest parcel with his sampling array running continuously, and his sensor suite building a progressively more detailed picture of the local biology and geology. And for approximately 90 seconds, he was a professional doing his job under difficult but manageable conditions. The Thari who came around the corner of the nearest structure at the end of those 90 seconds was not, by any objective measure, expecting to find what Zuillda looked like standing in the agricultural margins of the settlement, and the expression on the Thari's face, and it was a face, structured around two forward-facing optical organs and a respiratory and vocalization opening, and arranged on a bilateral symmetry that was deeply and uncomfortably familiar. Went through several distinct phases in rapid sequence that Zuillda's behavioral analysis software cataloged as surprise, confusion, fear, and a fourth state that the software labeled as threat assessment before the Thari made a decision and acted on it. The Thari was wearing a uniform. Zuillda noticed this because uniforms implied institutional authority, and institutional authority implied social organization, and social organization implied exactly the kind of cognitive complexity that the survey had classified as absent. And he was adding this to his running mental list of things the survey had gotten wrong when the Thari reached to a holster on its hip and produced a chemically propelled ballistic projectile delivery device of compact design and pointed it at Zuillda with the two-handed grip of someone who had been trained in its use. Threshold, Zuillda said, in a voice of absolute professional composure, I am experiencing my first direct contact with a Thari entity who appears to be a law enforcement or security class individual based on the uniform and equipment profile, and I want to report that the contact is not going well. The Thari said something. Zuillda's translation matrix, calibrated for sub-sentient biological acoustic output, returned a processing error, and then, after a moment, offered a best-effort interpretation that read simply as complex structured vocalization, language probable, which was the translation matrix's way of saying that it was hearing words and had no idea what they meant but was fairly confident they were words. I am also noting, Zuillda continued, maintaining the same even tone, that my translation matrix is not calibrated for actual language, which is a direct consequence of the suit and equipment package having been assembled against a sub-sentient biological classification, and I am adding this to my pre-deployment concern notation as item 18. The Thari said something else, louder this time, and took several steps backward without lowering the projectile delivery device, and Zuillda raised both his primary manipulator appendages in what he hoped was a universally interpretable gesture of non-aggression, though he was aware that the gesture was being performed by something that was 3.8 meters tall and looked like a nightmare, and that the likelihood of it being interpreted as non-aggressive was not something he would have bet money on. I would like to suggest, Zuillda said to the channel, that someone up there start working on a translation protocol, because I appear to be having a conversation that I am only participating in from one side, and the other participant is becoming increasingly agitated. We're on it, said Voss, in a tone that suggested they were not on it in any urgent or organized way. I would like you to be on it with some speed, Voss, because the entity in front of me is showing physiological stress indicators that my behavioral analysis software is categorizing as pre-escalation, and I would prefer to resolve this situation through communication rather than through whatever the alternative is, Zuillda said, and then the Thari officer made a decision, and the alternative presented itself. The sound of the chemically-propelled ballistic projectile delivery device discharging was sharp and flat and entirely unambiguous, and the projectile impacted Zuillda's shield array at the left thoracic housing with a force reading that his suit logged as 740 newtons of kinetic transfer, which was not dangerous to him, but was not nothing either. And his shield array absorbed it and redistributed the energy across the field matrix with the smooth competence of equipment that had been designed for exactly this kind of situation. And Zuillda stood there and took it, and then stood there for another moment afterward, processing the fact that he had just been shot at. "Threshold," he said, "I am formally reporting that I have sustained a targeted kinetic impact event from a chemically accelerated ballistic projectile delivery system operated by the Thari law enforcement entity, and that my shield array has absorbed the impact without structural compromise to the suit. And that I want this incident logged in my mission record as evidence that the operational conditions on this planet are materially different from those described in the survey documentation, and that these differences are not theoretical in nature, but are in fact shooting at me." "Are you okay?" said Voss, which was the first time Voss had asked him that, and Zuillda noted it. "I am physically uncompromised, thank you for asking, though I want to note that being physically uncompromised and being okay are not the same thing, and I would describe my current status as one but not the other," Zuillda said, taking several large steps backward as the Thari officer discharged the projectile device twice more in quick succession, both impacts logging in the same force range as the first, and then the officer turned and ran in the direction of the settlement interior, which his behavioral analysis software categorized as retreat combined with alarm communication behavior, suggesting the officer was going to get more officers. "Drex," Zuillda said, moving back toward the agricultural margins and trying to find a position that offered some concealment while his sensors tracked the officer's trajectory through the settlement, "I need you to understand the situation I am in right now, because I want to make sure that when I file my formal complaint about this deployment, the people reviewing it have a clear picture of what actually happened down here. So I am going to describe it to you plainly, and I need you to tell me that you are listening and comprehending." "I'm listening," said Drex, and his voice had the quality of a man who was smiling but had decided not to let the smile into his voice, which was not entirely successful. "I am standing on a planet that the survey said was empty, and that is demonstrably not empty, wearing a suit that was calibrated for a planet that was empty, and that is therefore completely wrong for the planet I am actually on. And I have just been shot at 3 times by a uniformed entity whose language I cannot understand, because my translation equipment was also calibrated for a planet that was empty. And that entity has now gone to retrieve additional uniformed entities who will presumably also want to shoot at me. And all of this is happening because a survey team 41 years ago flew past this planet at warp 6 and wrote 3 paragraphs about what they thought they saw. And I want you to tell me, in whatever words feel appropriate to you, how this constitutes a reasonable set of operational conditions for a field assessor conducting a standard geological survey," Zuillda said. There was a pause, and then Drex said, "I mean, when you lay it all out like that, it does seem like maybe the pre-mission planning phase had some gaps in it." And in the background, Voss made a sound that was unmistakably laughter, and then Drex added, "Also, I want to say, for what it's worth, that from up here the visual on you moving through that agricultural area is genuinely one of the more remarkable things I've seen in 8 years on this ship, and I mean that in a completely sincere way." "I don't want sincerity, Drex, I want a translation protocol and a revised operational plan," Zuillda said. "We're working on the translation protocol," Voss said, with slightly more credibility than the last time he'd said it. "How many of them are coming back?" Drex asked. Zuillda checked his sensor, tracking on the officer's trajectory and the secondary contacts that were now beginning to resolve in the same area of the settlement, and ran a quick count of the signatures moving in his direction with the purposeful speed of entities who had been told there was something in the agricultural margins that needed dealing with. "My sensor array is tracking what appears to be 4 additional entities moving toward my position in a coordinated pattern consistent with a search and containment approach, all of them showing the same uniform profile as the first officer. And I want to note that 4 law enforcement entities responding to a single report in what appears to be a settlement of this size suggests that whatever the first officer told them about what she saw was taken very seriously indeed," Zuillda said. and then moved further back into the agricultural margins and began running his geological sampling array on the soil composition because he was here to do a job, and the job was not going to do itself. And if he was going to be shot at, he was at least going to have good core sample data to show for it.
She said Drex.
Preliminary biological assessment based on morphological indicators suggests the first officer was female, yes, and I mention this only because it is relevant to my biological classification documentation and not because I think it changes anything about the situation, Zuillda said. I just think it's interesting that the first person on this whole planet to meet you was a woman, and her immediate reaction was to shoot you, Drex said, and I want you to know I'm not drawing any conclusions from that. I'm just noting it as an interesting data point. File it wherever you like, Drex, I'm busy, Zuillda said, and kept his sampling array running as the 4 additional officers spread out through the agricultural margins in his direction, and the settlement of 7 Theta 9 woke up around him to the fact that something had arrived that it had not been expecting and was not sure what to do about, and the morning, which had started badly, continued in the direction it had established for itself with considerable commitment. The agricultural margins of the settlement turned out to offer considerably less concealment than Zuillda had hoped, which was a pattern he was beginning to recognize as characteristic of how this particular planet was going to treat his optimism generally. The cultivated parcels were low-growing crops of various types that his biological sampling array was cataloging with professional enthusiasm, while the rest of him was trying to use them as cover. And the fundamental problem was that the crops were approximately 1 meter tall, and he was approximately 3.8 meters tall, and the mathematics of that relationship were not working in his favor regardless of how carefully he moved or how much he wanted them to. He could track the 4 officers on his sensor array as they spread through the margins in a search pattern that was organized and methodical and spoke well of whoever had trained them. And he moved in the opposite direction with the exosuit producing its hydraulic commentary on every step in a way that he was increasingly convinced was audible to anyone within a significant radius, which was not a helpful property in a suit that was supposed to be helping him maintain a low observational profile. A concept the suit appeared to have no relationship with whatsoever. Threshold, Zuillda said, moving between 2 cultivated parcels and running his sensor array in a full 360 sweep, while his sampling equipment continued its automated collection cycle. I am currently evading 4 law enforcement entities in the agricultural periphery of the settlement and conducting my preliminary survey work simultaneously. And I want to note that this is not a combination of activities that the mission parameters document described as a likely operational scenario, and that if it had, I would have had follow-up questions during the briefing phase. How's the evasion going? Voss asked, with what sounded like genuine interest in the answer, which Zuillda suspected was less about concern for his well-being and more about the entertainment value of the visual feed the ship was pulling from his suit's external sensors. The evasion is going in the way that most things on this planet are going, which is to say not as well as I would like and considerably worse than the original planning suggested it would. And I attribute this primarily to the fact that I am 3.8 meters tall, and the vegetation I am attempting to use for concealment is 1 meter tall, and the officers I am attempting to conceal myself from are approximately 1.7 meters tall, and can therefore see over the vegetation and directly to where I am, which means that the concealment strategy has a significant structural flaw that I identified approximately 4 minutes ago and have not yet found a solution to. Zuillda said and then stopped moving because 2 of the officers had changed their trajectory in a way that suggested they had heard something, and the something they had heard was almost certainly the suit. He stood completely still and ran a quiet mode protocol on the suit's movement systems, which reduced the hydraulic noise from its normal register of profound mechanical complaint to a slightly lower register of mechanical complaint that was technically quieter but remained, in his assessment, entirely too audible for the situation he was in. His sensor array continued running silently in the background, and the data it was returning was interesting enough that he found himself genuinely divided between the professional imperative to keep collecting it and the more immediate imperative to not get shot at again, and in the end, he let the array run because the data was that interesting. The electromagnetic signal analysis he had been running since landing was now returning a picture that his sensor suite was having to work to process, not because the signals were weak, but because there were a lot of them, layered across multiple frequency bands in a complex overlapping pattern that spoke to a communications infrastructure of considerable development and reach. He was picking up broadcast signals, point-to-point transmissions, and what appeared to be a network of repeating relay stations, whose geographic distribution his triangulation software was using to build a map of the settlement's communications footprint, and the footprint extended well beyond the 4 square kilometers of developed surface he had initially estimated. Voss, Zuillda said, very quietly, in the tone of someone who has found something in the data that they need to share immediately, but who is also standing very still, while 4 armed officers look for them. I need you to run a comparison for me between the electromagnetic signal density readings I am transmitting right now and the signal profile data from the original survey documentation, and I need you to tell me what the original survey logged in this frequency range. There was a brief pause while Voss pulled the data, and then Voss said, the original survey logged no significant electromagnetic signal activity in any frequency band, baseline ambient only, nothing structured or repeating. And what am I currently reading? Zuillda said. You are currently reading, Voss said, with a quality in his voice that suggested he was looking at the numbers and finding them surprising. A structured electromagnetic signal environment across 14 distinct frequency bands with repeating transmission patterns on at least 6 of them, and what looks like a very active broadcast signal on the 100 MHz range, which is, that's radio, Zuillda. That's a functioning radio communications network. That is correct, and I want you to note the contrast between what the survey logged and what I am currently reading, because the difference between baseline ambient electromagnetic activity and a functioning 14-band communications network is not the kind of difference that emerges over a short period. Communications infrastructure of this complexity requires years of development and deployment. And I am going to need someone on the ship to start thinking about what that timeline implies for the question of when this civilization reached the threshold of complexity that should have triggered a reclassification review, Zuillda said, and then one of the officers came around the end of the crop parcel he was standing beside, and they looked at each other at a range of approximately 8 meters, and the officer made a sound that Zuillda's translation matrix logged as complex structured vocalization. Alarm register, and reached for her projectile device. I am re-engaging with the law enforcement entities, Zuillda said, and moved. Moving in the exosuit at speed was an experience that his body had not yet fully made peace with, because the suit's locomotion system was designed to translate his own movement into a larger stride pattern, and the result was that each step covered approximately 2.5 meters of ground, which was efficient from a distance-covering perspective, but which also meant that moving at anything approaching urgency produced a sound that his audio sensors logged as a series of impacts in the 100 to 140 decibel range, which was to say the kind of sound that causes people to stop whatever they are doing and look in the direction it is coming from. Every person in the visible portion of the settlement stopped whatever they were doing and looked in the direction it was coming from. Zuillda crossed the agricultural margin in 11 strides and reached the outer edge of the developed settlement area and stopped, because stopping was the only realistic option, because ahead of him was a street with structures on both sides and Thari individuals standing on it who had all ceased their various activities and were looking at him with an intensity that his behavioral analysis software categorized, with what he felt was an admirable economy of description, as collective alarm response. Threshold, Zuillda said, standing at the edge of the street with 4 officers behind him and an unknown number of civilians in front of him, and the suit's hydraulic systems cycling down from their exertion register with a noise that did not help the situation. I want to update my population estimate for this settlement, because I have better sensor coverage now that I am in the developed area. And my updated estimate for this specific settlement is between 22 and 28,000 individual entities, and I am also picking up additional settlement signatures on my long-range sensor array that suggest this is not a standalone community, but is part of a broader populated network across this region of the planet. How broad, said Caleb, who had been quiet for long enough that his re-entry into the conversation carried the weight of someone who had been doing calculations he was not enjoying. I am still building the picture, Caleb, but the electromagnetic signal network I am mapping has a footprint that extends to the limits of my current sensor range, which is approximately 200 kilometers in all directions from my current position. And within that range, I am counting signal clusters consistent with settled communities at a density that I am going to need more time to fully quantify, but that I can tell you right now is not consistent with a sub-sentient biological classification in any interpretation of that term that I am aware of, Zuillda said, and took a step backward as 3 of the officers arrived at the edge of the agricultural margin behind him and stopped, apparently also assessing the situation and finding it complicated. The street had gone very quiet. The Thari individuals who had been on it were still there, most of them having retreated to doorways and the margins of the structures, and they were watching him with the focused and wary attention of a population that had collectively decided that the thing on their street was a problem, but had not yet agreed on what kind of problem it was or what to do about it. A small child standing in a doorway approximately 15 meters away was staring at him with an expression that his behavioral analysis software, which was not really designed for this kind of assessment, nevertheless categorized as curiosity rather than fear, which was the only emotionally positive reading he had gotten from anyone on the planet so far, and which he noted without comment. "I am going to attempt to move through the settlement toward the coordinates of the primary geological survey transect," Zuillda said, while continuing to collect sensor data, "and I want to flag that this plan has significant operational challenges, the primary one being that approximately 30 Thari individuals are currently watching me from this street, and the 4 officers who have been following me are still behind me, and my translation matrix is still not functioning in any useful way. So my ability to communicate non-aggressive intent to any of them remains extremely limited. The translation matrix team says they need another 6 hours minimum to develop a working baseline from your audio captures," Voss said.
6 hours, Zuillda said.
"They're working as fast as they can," Voss said, in a tone that suggested they might not be working as fast as they could. "Tell them," Zuillda said with careful precision, "that I am standing in the middle of a settlement of approximately 25,000 entities who are all looking at me, that I have been shot at 3 times this morning, that my translation equipment is non-functional, that my concealment equipment is also non-functional in any practical sense, and that 6 hours is a timeline I would like them to reconsider in light of those operational realities. And tell them I said this in a tone that conveyed urgency without being unprofessional." "I'll pass it along," Voss said. "Zuillda," said Drex, "what do they look like, the ones on the street? Give me a description, because the visual feed from your suit doesn't have great resolution on the fine detail." Zuillda looked at the Thari individuals watching him from the street and the doorways, and ran a quick morphological analysis sweep, while he continued backing slowly toward a wider thoroughfare that his sensor map suggested would give him more room to maneuver, and said, "They are bilaterally symmetrical bipedal entities of average height approximately 1.7 meters, with 2 upper manipulator limbs, forward-facing paired optical organs. A single respiratory and vocalization aperture on the lower facial region, and a general body plan that is, and I want to be precise about this because it is going to be relevant to a number of subsequent discussions, remarkably consistent with the standard humanoid template that appears across multiple species in the Galactic Survey database. They are, to the degree that this is a useful description, very similar to humans. They are built like humans, they move like humans. They are organized in family and social groupings, consistent with human analog species, and the structures they have built around them are the kinds of structures that human analog species build when they have been developing their civilization for several hundred years." There was a silence on the channel.
"Oh," said Drex.
"Yes," said Zuillda. "And they put you in that suit," Drex said, and now the smile was fully in his voice, uncontained and delighted, to blend in with these people. "They put me in this suit," Zuillda confirmed, "to blend in with a planet they said contained colonial cellular clusters. Yes, and the fact that the planet actually contains human analog entities with a functioning civilization and a radio communications network was not considered in the equipment selection process. And the result is that I am currently standing in the middle of their street, looking like something that should not exist and could not possibly belong here under any interpretation of the available evidence."
"How are they taking it?" Voss asked.
"They are taking it," Zuillda said, "in the way that a population of rational entities takes the appearance of a 3.8-meter asymmetrical mechanical organism in their agricultural margins, which is to say they are not taking it well. They are taking it with alarm and hostility, and in the case of the law enforcement entities with repeated projectile discharge, and I want to formally state that their response is entirely reasonable given the circumstances, and that I bear them no ill will for it. I simply wish I was not the circumstances." He had reached the wider thoroughfare now, and his sensor array was painting a better picture of the settlement's layout, and he turned his attention to the geological data his sampling equipment had been collecting throughout all of this, because the geological data was the actual reason he was here, and it was beginning to return numbers that pulled at his professional attention in ways that the chaos around him could not entirely suppress. The subsurface composition readings were exceptional. His sampling array was pulling trace element signatures from the soil chemistry that implied a subsurface mineral profile of extraordinary richness, the kind of readings that made extraction companies very interested and very motivated, and he filed the data automatically while simultaneously tracking the officers regrouping behind him and the growing crowd of Thari civilians maintaining a cautious perimeter at what they had apparently collectively decided was a safe distance. Threshold, Zuillda said, running his population density extrapolation model in the background while he continued moving through the settlement toward his survey coordinates. I need to give you a preliminary population figure for this planet, and I want to preface it by saying that this is an extrapolation based on current sensor data and electromagnetic signal density mapping, and should be treated as an estimate with an error margin of approximately 15% in either direction. And with that caveat, I am going to tell you that my preliminary estimate for the total intelligent entity population of MEC-Catalogue 7 Theta 9 is between 900 million and 1.2 billion individual entities. The silence that followed this was the longest silence the channel had produced since Zuillda had come aboard the threshold, and it had a different quality from all the silences that had come before it, a heavier and more complicated quality, the silence of people doing arithmetic that was returning an answer none of them had prepared a response to. Drex broke it first, and when he spoke his voice had lost some of its ease, not all of it, but some enough to be noticeable.
Say that number again.
Between 900 million and 1.2 billion individual intelligent entities, Drex, and I am rounding conservatively, because I would rather give you a number I can defend than a number that turns out to be optimistic, and I want to be clear that this is not a rounding error in the original survey data. This is not 15 or 20% off. The original survey classified this planet as sub-sentient, and what I am standing in the middle of right now is a functioning civilization with 1 billion people in it, and those two things cannot be reconciled by any methodology I am aware of. They are simply completely different planets, Zuillda said. Caleb said something, but it was quiet enough that the channel didn't pick it up clearly, and when Zuillda asked him to repeat it, Caleb said, in a voice that had the specific texture of a man watching a problem he had thought was contained, revealing that it was not contained at all, that he needed to make a call to MEC regional operations, and that he would be back on the channel shortly. You do that, Zuillda said, and kept moving, and kept collecting data, and behind him the officers kept following at a distance that suggested they had decided pursuit was their mandate even if they weren't entirely sure what they would do if they caught him. And around him, the settlement of 7 Theta 9 went about its morning in the disrupted and agitated way of a community that had encountered something it had no framework for and was doing its best to manage anyway, which, Zuillda reflected, was actually a fairly relatable response to the situation because he was doing exactly the same thing. The thing about being a professional, Zuillda had always believed, was that professionalism was not a conditional state that you maintained only when circumstances were convenient for it. Professionalism was precisely what you demonstrated when circumstances were actively hostile to it. When the data collection equipment was running in one corner of your attention, while another corner was tracking 4 law enforcement officers who wanted to shoot you, and a third corner was managing the suit's increasingly creative interpretations of what nominal meant, and a fourth corner was listening to your crewmates discuss you on an open channel with the warmth and collegial generosity of people reviewing a mildly amusing pest problem. He had found a position between 2 larger structures on the settlement's eastern edge that offered reasonable access to the subsurface geology he needed to sample, while also providing enough structural mass on either side to give his sensor array some useful data about local construction materials and methods, and he had deployed his ground-penetrating geological array and settled in to do the work he had been sent here to do. And for approximately 4 minutes, the work proceeded with something approaching the normalcy he associated with his profession, before Drex's voice came through the comm channel with the particular quality it got when Drex had been thinking about something and had decided that thinking about it privately was less enjoyable than sharing it. So I've been looking at your visual feed, Drex said, and I want to ask you something, and I need you to take this in the spirit of genuine professional curiosity rather than as any kind of personal commentary, and the question is this. When you're standing between those 2 buildings doing whatever it is you're doing with your ground equipment, and the local inhabitants are watching you from the ends of the street, do you have any sense at all of what you look like to them? Because I have been trying to construct that perspective from up here, and I keep arriving at descriptions that I don't think I have the vocabulary to fully do justice to. I have a very clear sense of what I look like to them, Drex, because I have a functioning self-awareness that the suit does not impair, and what I look like to them is exactly what I look like to anyone who sees this suit, which is something that has no business existing in any environment that contains other living things. And I would like you to know that I am filing the visual documentation from my external sensors alongside my formal equipment complaint, so that anyone who reviews my case will be able to see for themselves exactly what the equipment allocation team considered an appropriate deployment configuration, Zuillda said, without looking up from his geological array readout, which was returning subsurface data of the kind that made his professional instincts sit up and pay close attention regardless of whatever else was happening around them. I pulled your equipment complaint this morning, Voss said, the one you filed before deployment, and I want to tell you that it currently has 19 items on it, which I think is a personal record for a pre-deployment complaint document in this ship's operational history, and I say that not to diminish your concerns, but because I feel like it's a milestone that deserves acknowledgement. It has 22 items now, Zuillda said. I've been adding to it throughout the morning as new issues present themselves, and by the time I'm done down here, I expect it to be the most comprehensively sourced equipment and operational planning complaint document that MEC's Regional Operations Division has ever received, and I intend to submit it with a request for a formal review panel rather than the standard administrative response. Because a standard administrative response is what you send when someone complains about a sticky door handle, and not what you send when someone was deployed onto an inhabited planet in a suit calibrated for microorganisms. 22 items, Drex said, with the reflective appreciation of someone savoring a number. Voss, do you know what the previous record was for pre- and during deployment complaint items on a single mission document? I don't, Voss said, but I feel like we should find out so we know how far we have to go. I'm going to ask you both, Zuillda said, adjusting the depth calibration on his geological array to push the scan down another 50 meters, where the trace element signatures were suggesting something very interesting was happening in the subsurface stratigraphy, to direct whatever portion of your attention is not currently occupied with discussing my complaint documentation towards something useful, such as the translation protocol that was supposed to be ready 6 hours ago and has not yet materialized, or the revised operational plan that I requested when it became clear that the original operational plan was built on a survey that was conducted at Warp 6 by people who apparently considered thoroughness an optional professional quality. The translation team says they have a partial baseline, Voss said, with the tone of someone delivering news they know is going to be received poorly and have decided to deliver quickly and step back from. And by partial they mean they can get you approximately 40% vocabulary coverage on the most commonly used terms, and they want to flag that the 40% figure represents an optimistic upper bound rather than a reliable minimum, and that the 40% does not include grammatical structures or tonal registers, so you'll be getting individual words without context, which is better than nothing but is, and this is their characterization, not mine, likely to produce some communication outcomes that may not fully reflect your intended meaning. 40% vocabulary coverage without grammatical structure or tonal register, Zuillda said, pausing in his geological work to give this the consideration it deserved, means that I will be able to understand approximately 4 words in 10 of what is said to me, with no reliable way to understand how those 4 words relate to each other or what emotional register they are being delivered in. Which means that my communication capability in any encounter with the local population will be somewhere between inadequate and actively counterproductive. That's a fair characterization, Voss said. Upload it anyway, Zuillda said, because 4 words in 10 is 4 more words than I currently have, and I will take whatever partial information is available and work with it, which is a skill I have been developing extensively since landing on this planet this morning. The geological array completed its first deep scan and returned a dataset that Zuillda looked at for a long moment before he said anything at all, because the dataset deserved a moment, the way that anything remarkable deserves a moment before you start talking about it. The subsurface mineral profile of the area around the settlement was not merely good. It was not merely the kind of good that justified a Class 7 extraction assessment. It was the kind of good that explained why MEC had been holding this acquisition in their portfolio for 41 years, waiting for the right time to move on it, because the rare element concentration in the subsurface stratigraphy at this location was among the highest he had recorded in a career that had taken him to 37 planets across 4 surveying contracts. And the distribution pattern suggested that this was not a localized deposit, but the surface expression of a much larger formation that extended through the subsurface geology of a significant portion of this region. Threshold, Zuillda said, and his professional voice had a quality in it now that was different from its usual measured register, a quality of genuine data-driven weight. I am transmitting my first geological array scan results, and I want to walk you through the primary findings, starting with the rare element concentration readings. Because these numbers are going to be relevant to a number of conversations that I expect we are going to be having in the near future, and I want everyone on the channel to understand what the ground actually contains. Go ahead, said Caleb, who had returned to the channel from his call to MEC Regional Operations with a quality about him that suggested the call had not improved his morning. The subsurface stratigraphy at this location shows rare element concentration levels that my array is measuring at between 400 and 600% above the threshold that MEC's own extraction viability guidelines define as exceptional, and I want to be clear about what exceptional means in MEC's own documented framework, which is that exceptional is the highest classification category in their viability scale and is defined as deposits whose extraction yield would place them in the top 2% of all cataloged acquisition targets in MEC's entire portfolio. So when I tell you that what I am reading is between 4 and 6 times the threshold for that classification, I want you to understand that I am describing mineral deposits of a quality that most assessors do not encounter in an entire career, and that the distribution pattern suggests this is not a local anomaly, but extends across a formation whose total scale I will need additional survey transects to fully characterize, Zuillda said. The channel was quiet in the way it got quiet when money was involved, which was a different quality of quiet from all the other kinds of quiet, and was recognizable immediately because it had a focused, attentive quality to it, the quality of people doing arithmetic that they liked the answer to. How far does the formation extend? Drex asked, and his voice had shed most of its amusement, not because the amusement was gone, but because something more focused had come to the front ahead of it. As I said, I need additional transects to characterize the full extent, but based on the gradient profile of the concentration readings my array is showing, the formation likely extends across a minimum of several hundred square kilometers of subsurface geology, and possibly considerably more. And I want to note for the record that the settlement of approximately 25,000 entities I am currently standing in the middle of is positioned directly above what appears to be one of the higher concentration nodes in this formation, which is a piece of information I am providing as a factual data point, and not as a recommendation of any kind, Zuillda said. Caleb, Drex said, are you getting these numbers? I am getting these numbers, Caleb said, in the voice of a man who was getting numbers he very much wanted and simultaneously receiving information he very much didn't want attached to those numbers, like an extraordinarily valuable package that had been delivered to the wrong address. I am going to continue my survey transects, Zuillda said, packing up his geological array and beginning to move toward his next sample location while his sensor array tracked the officers, who were maintaining their cautious distance with the professional persistence of individuals who had decided that their job was to follow the thing and had not yet received updated guidance on what to do beyond that. And while I am doing that, I would like someone on the ship to explain to me what Caleb's call to MEC regional operations produced in terms of revised operational guidance, because I have been operating on the original mission parameters for this entire morning, and those parameters were built for a planet that does not exist, and I think it is past time for someone in a position of authority to produce parameters for the planet that does exist. MEC regional operations, Caleb said, with the careful delivery of someone reading from notes they have made to ensure they get the language exactly right, has acknowledged receipt of the updated biological assessment data, and has indicated that they are reviewing the situation in consultation with the legal and acquisitions teams, and that updated operational guidance will be forthcoming when that review is complete, and in the meantime, the existing mission parameters remain in effect. The existing mission parameters remain in effect, Zuillda said, taking a long stride across an open area and producing the 120 decibel footfall impact that caused every Thari individual within visual range to flinch backward in unison, which means that my current operational mandate is to conduct a geological assessment of a planet that has 1 billion people on it, using parameters written for a planet with no people on it. And MEC Regional Operations is comfortable with that situation while their legal team finishes its coffee and thinks about it. That is not precisely how I would characterize the, Caleb began. Caleb, I have a great deal of respect for your ability to characterize things in ways that make them sound more organized and intentional than they are, and I have spent 2 weeks on this ship developing that respect, but I want to suggest that the current situation may be beyond the reach of even your considerable characterization skills, and that what is actually happening is that MEC sent me down here with the wrong equipment, the wrong information, and the wrong parameters. And is now asking me to keep working while they figure out how to process the fact that their 41-year-old acquisition target has 1 billion inhabitants. And I am going to keep working because that is my job and I am a professional. But I want it clearly understood that I am doing so under protest, and that my protest is documented, Zuillda said. Your protest is noted, Caleb said. My protest is documented, Caleb. There is a difference. Noted implies it has been heard and may be considered. Documented implies it exists in a file that will survive this conversation and can be reviewed by parties who are not on this channel, Zuillda said. Your protest is documented, Caleb said, with the resignation of a man updating his own mental filing system. The translation matrix partial upload completed during this exchange, and Zuillda ran a quick calibration test against the audio. His sensors had been recording from the Thari officers following him, and the results were approximately as useful as Voss had suggested they would be, which was to say marginally useful in the way that a map with 40% of the roads missing is marginally useful. Technically better than nothing, but capable of sending you somewhere significantly worse than where you were trying to go if you trusted it without reservation. He could now identify individual words in the officers' communications with each other, words that his matrix was translating as approximations, something like follow, something like report, something like unknown, something that might be danger or might be large. The matrix wasn't certain, but the words arrived without grammar and without relationship to each other, and constructing meaning from them was an exercise in speculation rather than communication. He arrived at his second survey transect location and deployed his geological array again and began the scan sequence. And while the array ran, he turned his attention to the biological data his sampling equipment had been accumulating throughout the morning, because the biological data was the other half of the picture he was building, and it was turning out to be at least as interesting as the geological data, and in ways that were significantly more complicated. I am running a preliminary biological complexity assessment on the accumulated sampling data from this morning, Zuillda said, and I want to share some of the headline findings with the channel, not because I expect anyone to act on them immediately, but because I think everyone should be working from the same information base, particularly given that MEC Regional Operations is apparently making decisions about this planet without the benefit of what I am currently looking at. Share away, said Drex, who had recovered his ease now that the geological numbers had been discussed and filed, and the excitement of them had settled into the background, and whose voice had returned to its default register of a man who found most things mildly entertaining and was prepared to be amused by whatever came next. The Thari entities, and I am going to use that designation throughout my documentation because I need a consistent term in Thari, is what I have been using internally, show a biological complexity profile that my assessment software is placing at a galactic sentience index score of between 72 and 78 on the standard 100-point scale, and I want to explain what that means in practical terms for anyone on this channel who is not familiar with the index. Which, based on previous conversations about survey methodology, I suspect may be most of you, Zuillda said. I know what the sentience index is, Drex said, with mild offense. Then you will know that 72 to 78 places the Thari comfortably within the range that the Galactic Survey Authority defines as confirmed sentient, well above the 50-point threshold for protected species classification, and within the range that requires mandatory contact and assessment protocols under GSA code. And you will also know that the minimum population threshold for those protocols to apply is 10,000 individual entities. And that I have already confirmed a population on this planet of between 900 million and 1.2 billion individual entities, which exceeds that threshold by a factor of approximately 100,000, and I want to take a moment to let that ratio sit with everyone before I continue, Zuillda said. The ratio sat with everyone for a moment. Zuillda, said Drex, and his voice had changed again in the way it kept changing when the data arrived at a new level of seriousness, not losing its ease entirely, but carrying something heavier underneath it. I want to ask you something, and I want you to understand that I'm asking it genuinely and not as a setup for anything. And the question is whether you think there is any scenario in which the numbers you are giving us today are wrong by a margin that would change the fundamental picture. No, Zuillda said, without hesitation or qualification. The sentience index reading has a margin of error of approximately 3 points in either direction, which means the Thari score could be as low as 69 or as high as 81, and the GSA protection threshold is 50, so the margin of error does not affect the classification outcome in any direction, and the population estimate has a 15% error margin, which means the actual population could be as low as 765 million. And the mandatory protocol threshold is 10,000, so the error margin does not affect the protocol trigger in any direction either, and the geological data has no error margin of significance because I am reading it directly from physical samples. So no, there is no scenario in which the numbers I am giving you today are wrong by a margin that would change the fundamental picture.
Right, said Drex. Yes, said Zuillda.
A silence settled over the channel that was the longest and most complicated one yet, and during it, Zuillda completed his second geological transect and packed his array, and moved to his third location and deployed again and let the scan run, and the scan returned numbers that were consistent with the first two transects. Exceptional subsurface mineral concentrations extending across the formation with a consistency that suggested the deposit was even larger than his initial estimate. And he filed all of it with the same professional thoroughness he brought to everything, because the data was the data regardless of what happened with it afterward, and his job was to collect it accurately and completely and let other people make decisions about it, though he was developing strong opinions about the quality of those decisions. It was during the third transect scan that the situation with the officers changed. He had been tracking them on his sensor array throughout the morning, and they had maintained their consistent following distance with the dogged professionalism of individuals who had been given a job, and were doing it regardless of the fact that the job was not producing any outcomes they had a framework for. But now his array was showing a new pattern, additional signatures approaching from the direction of the settlement center with a speed and directional convergence that his tactical analysis software, which he rarely used in geological survey work, but which had been running continuously since the first projectile impacted his shield array, flagged as coordinated response rather than incidental movement. I am detecting what appears to be a coordinated response from additional law enforcement entities, Zuillda said, converging on my position from multiple directions, which suggests that the officers who have been following me this morning have made a report to a central authority, and that authority has decided that the four-officer follow-and-observe approach is not achieving the outcomes they want, and has authorized a more organized response, which I think shows good institutional thinking on their part, and I want to note that observation in my assessment documentation under social organization and command structure. You're going to write a positive performance review for the people trying to catch you, Voss said, with the delighted disbelief of someone encountering something they had not anticipated. I am going to document what I observe accurately and completely, Voss, which is what I am paid to do, and what I observe is that the Thari law enforcement entities have demonstrated organized response protocols, chain of command communication, and coordinated tactical deployment, all of which are relevant data points for their civilizational complexity assessment. And the fact that the civilizational complexity they are demonstrating is currently being directed at me does not make it less worth documenting, Zuillda said, and began moving his geological array to a new position that his sensor map suggested would give him better coverage of the formation's northern boundary, while also offering slightly more structural cover than his current location. Because thorough documentation and not getting shot at were both professional priorities, and he saw no reason to sacrifice one for the other if he didn't have to. How many are coming? Drex asked. My sensor array is currently tracking 11 additional signatures in the coordinated approach pattern, which combined with the 4 who have been following me, gives a total response force of 15 law enforcement entities. And I want to note that 15 officers responding to a single report in a settlement of 25,000 is a significant resource deployment that suggests the Thari institutional authorities are taking this situation seriously. Which again speaks well of their organizational capacity, Zuillda said. 15, Drex said, and then to Voss in the slightly quieter tone of someone speaking to a person next to them rather than into a comm channel, though not quiet enough that the channel didn't pick it up. Do you know, I actually feel a little bit bad for them. You feel bad for the 15 officers? Voss asked. I feel bad for all of them. Honestly, the whole settlement. They're just going about their morning and this thing shows up in their agricultural margins and starts doing whatever Zuillda does, and they have absolutely no context for any of it. And now they've got 15 officers trying to manage a situation that 15 officers is not really the right tool for, Drex said, and then added, I mean, I also think it's funny. I want to be clear that I also think it's funny, but I feel both things. I appreciate your emotional complexity, Drex, Zuillda said, and I want to note that your observation about 15 officers not being the right tool for the situation is accurate, and that the reason it's accurate is that no number of officers with chemically propelled ballistic projectile delivery systems is really the right tool for a situation involving a shielded exosuit assessor from an interstellar survey company. And the reason I find that observation relevant is that the asymmetry between what they have and what I have is an asymmetry that exists entirely, because MEC sent me down here with equipment designed for a planet that doesn't have anyone on it, and if the original survey had been conducted properly, none of these 15 officers would be having this particular morning. You're blaming MEC for the officers having a bad morning, Voss said. I'm blaming MEC for a chain of consequences that started with a Warp 6 flyby 41 years ago and has produced, among other outcomes, 15 Thari law enforcement entities whose morning has been significantly disrupted by something they have no framework for understanding, and which is in their community because a survey team couldn't be bothered to slow down, Zuillda said, and picked up his geological array and moved again. Staying ahead of the converging signatures by a margin that his sensor map suggested was comfortable, but that he was not inclined to test unnecessarily. He had now completed 3 full transects, and the geological picture was clear enough that he could start constructing the preliminary resources report that was the primary deliverable of his mission, and he set his documentation system to passive accumulation mode and let it draw from his running sensor data while he continued working, because a preliminary resources report was going to be needed regardless of everything else. And when MEC Regional Operations finished consulting with their legal team and came back with their updated operational guidance, the geological data was going to be the center of whatever conversation followed, and Zuillda intended for that data to be thorough, accurate, and beyond professional reproach. I want to ask you something, Zuillda said to Drex, as he settled into his 4th transect position and deployed his array for what he hoped would be a full scan cycle without interruption. And I want you to answer it honestly rather than in whatever way you think will be most entertaining, because it is a question that matters to me professionally, and I would like a straight answer. I'll do my best, Drex said, with the tone of a man making a promise he intended to keep within reason. When Prek was medevaced off this ship at Junction Station 14, Zuillda said, did he know what planet he was being sent to, and did he know what the survey said about it? And is there any possibility that his bilateral joint inflammation was not entirely unrelated to that information? The silence that followed this question was brief, but had a specific quality to it, the quality of people who know an answer and are evaluating whether telling it will cost them anything significant. Prek, Drex said eventually, was a very thorough professional who read his briefing documents carefully and completely before every deployment, and I would say that his thoroughness in that regard was among his more notable qualities. So he read the survey, Zuillda said. I would be surprised if he hadn't, Drex said. And he saw the exosuit, Zuillda said. The exosuit had been in the deployment bay for about a week before we reached Junction Station, Drex said, with a careful neutrality that was itself a kind of answer. And within that week, Zuillda said, he developed a bilateral joint inflammation of sufficient severity to require immediate specialist facility care. Medicine is a complicated field, Drex said, and I am not qualified to speak to the specific pathology. No, Zuillda said, but you could speak to whether you think it's a coincidence. I think, Drex said, that Prek was a man who understood his options and made a decision that he felt was in his best professional and personal interest, and I think that characterization covers most of what I know about the situation without me having to speculate about things I wasn't directly involved in. I see, Zuillda said. For what it's worth, Voss said, and his voice had the slightly uncomfortable quality of someone contributing to a conversation they had been listening to and felt obligated to be honest in. We did try to contact 3 other assessors before you, and all 3 of them had scheduling conflicts that came up fairly suddenly after they received the mission briefing documents. 3 other assessors, Zuillda said. You were 4th on the list, Voss said. I was 4th on the list, Zuillda said, and the first 3 developed scheduling conflicts after reading the briefing, and the 4th, which is me, was sitting at Junction Station 14 with nowhere to be for 3 more days and a bonus figure that was large enough to override what should have been my better judgment. The bonus was very competitive, Caleb offered, in the tone of a man finding the most positive available framing for a situation that did not have many positive framings available. The bonus was a number designed to get someone to say yes after 3 people had said no, Zuillda said, and it worked, and here I am, and I would like everyone on this channel to reflect, at whatever length feels appropriate to them, on the sequence of decisions that produced this outcome, and I would like that reflection to happen while I finish my geological survey of a planet with 1 billion people on it and 15 law enforcement officers trying to work out what to do about me." Nobody said anything for a moment, and in the background of the channel, he could hear Voss saying something quietly to Drex that the channel gain was too low to pick up, and then Drex laughed, not the broad, entertained laugh he used when something was funny at Zuillda's expense, but a quieter one, more genuine, and Zuillda filed the distinction in the same mental category where he kept all the other data he was collecting today and kept working. The fourth transect was the best geological data Zuillda had collected all morning, which was saying something given that all of the morning's geological data had been exceptional, and he filed it with the automatic satisfaction of a professional whose instruments are working correctly even when everything surrounding the instruments is working very incorrectly indeed. The subsurface formation was proving to be even more extensive than his initial estimates had suggested, and its consistency across all 4 transect locations pointed toward a deposit structure that was not a local concentration, but a regional feature of significant geological age, the kind of formation that took hundreds of millions of years to develop, and that extraction companies built entire operational divisions around when they found one. He was aware, in the part of his professional mind that ran parallel to the data collection and never fully went quiet, that the numbers he was building in his preliminary resources report were the kind of numbers that made decisions easier for people who thought in terms of resources and harder for people who thought in terms of everything else, and he filed that awareness alongside the data without letting it affect the data. Because the data was the data and his job was to collect it, and the decisions belonged to other people, a principle he had operated on for 14 years and which was, for the first time in those 14 years, beginning to feel like a principle that deserved some examination. The 15 officers had settled into a loose perimeter around his current position, at a distance his sensor array measured as approximately 60 meters, which his tactical analysis software characterized as a containment posture rather than an assault posture, suggesting that the Thari institutional authorities had issued updated guidance to hold position and observe rather than engage directly. Which was good tactical thinking, given that the direct engagement approach had produced 3 projectile impacts and no meaningful outcomes earlier in the morning. He noted this adaptation in his assessment documentation under command flexibility and revised tactical response, and moved on to his 5th transect location, while the perimeter moved with him at its consistent 60-meter distance, the whole arrangement proceeding through the settlement's eastern edge like a very slow and mutually uncomfortable parade. "Threshold," Zuillda said, settling into his 5th transect position and deploying his array while his suit ran a routine systems check that returned the same nominal readings it had been returning all day, nominal still meaning what it had meant at the start, which was that he was not dead. "I would like to use the data collection interval while my array is running to discuss the original survey documentation for this planet in some detail. Because I have been thinking about it throughout the morning, and I have questions that I think need to be answered before we go any further with the operational planning conversation, and I want Caleb in particular to be actively listening, because some of these questions have implications for MEC's legal and administrative position that I think he will want to be across." "I'm listening," Caleb said, in the voice of a man who was already listening in the specific way that people listen when they expect to hear something they will need to respond to carefully. "Good," Zuillda said, and pulled the survey documentation up on his internal display and began reading through it with the methodical attention he brought to any technical document, not skimming but reading, properly, the way his assessment training had taught him to read field documentation, looking not just at what was there, but at what wasn't there, and what the gaps between the present and absent elements implied about how the work had been done. "I want to start with the survey team itself, because the documentation lists the contractor as Harvin Survey Associates, and I want to know what anyone on this ship can tell me about Harvin Survey Associates, because the name does not appear in my professional database, and I have a reasonably comprehensive professional database." "Harvin Survey Associates," Voss said, and there was the sound of him pulling records. A brief interval of quiet that had the texture of a search running, was a mid-tier planetary survey contractor that operated primarily in MEC's acquisition zones from approximately 60 to 15 years ago, and they were acquired by MEC's subsidiary holdings division about 22 years ago, and subsequently dissolved and folded into MEC's internal survey operations. And their existing contracts and survey documentation were absorbed into MEC's archive at the time of dissolution, which means that MEC now owns all of Harvin's historical work product, including whatever methodology and liability attached to it. MEC absorbed Harvin's liability when they dissolved the company, Zuillda said, making sure this was clearly on the channel record. That would be the standard legal consequence of a full acquisition and dissolution, yes, Caleb said, with the careful precision of someone confirming a fact they would prefer wasn't a fact, but cannot honestly deny. So when I say that the survey documentation for 7 Theta 9 has significant methodological problems, I am describing a document whose associated liability now belongs entirely to MEC, because the company that produced it no longer exists as a separate entity, and MEC both owns the document and owns the consequences of the document, which is a position I imagine their legal team is currently thinking very hard about, Zuillda said. The legal team is reviewing all relevant aspects of the situation, Caleb said. I'm sure they are, Zuillda said, and I want to give them some additional material to review, because I have been reading this survey documentation very carefully, and I want to walk through what it actually says and what it demonstrably does not say. And I want everyone on this channel to understand that what I am about to describe is not me being critical for the sake of criticism. It is me reading a professional document against the standard that professional documents in this field are supposed to meet, a standard that I know well because I produce documents to that standard for a living. Go ahead, said Drex, whose voice had the quality of someone genuinely interested in what was coming, which Zuillda suspected was partly professional curiosity and partly the anticipation of something entertaining, and he had decided to accept both motivations as equally valid because the outcome was the same either way. The survey was filed 41 years ago by a 3-person Harvin Survey Associates team, whose individual names are listed in the documentation as Team Lead Osric Fenwell, Survey Technician Barath Cullen, and Data Analyst Senna Vale, and the mission log shows that their survey vessel entered the 7 Theta 9 system on day 1 of the survey window, conducted the single orbital observation pass that we have already discussed at the velocity we have already discussed, and departed the system on day 2, and I want to pause on that timeline because it is important, Zuillda said. They were there for 2 days, Voss said. They were there for 2 days, Zuillda confirmed, and in those 2 days they conducted 1 orbital pass and collected the data that forms the entire evidentiary basis for the sub-sentient classification that has governed this planet's status for 41 years, and that MEC has used as the legal foundation for an acquisition that is now the subject of a review by MEC's legal team. And I want to be precise about what a proper survey of a Class M planet requires in terms of time and methodology, because I think the contrast is instructive. What does a proper survey require? Voss asked, and Zuillda noted that Voss was asking in a tone of genuine inquiry rather than the rhetorical setup quality his questions sometimes had, which suggested he actually didn't know, which was itself a data point about how well the people on this ship understood the work Zuillda did. Proper Class M planetary survey, conducted to Galactic Survey Authority standards, which are the standards that any survey used as the basis for a sentience classification is supposed to meet, requires a minimum of 30 days of surface and atmospheric sampling across a statistically representative geographic distribution, a biological complexity assessment drawing from a minimum of 100 distinct sample sites spread across all major biome types, an electromagnetic and atmospheric analysis protocol running continuous monitoring across all relevant frequency ranges for a minimum of 72 hours, and an orbital observation component that supplements rather than replaces the surface work, and the entire dataset is supposed to be reviewed by a qualified assessor who signs off on the classification with their professional credentials attached, meaning they are personally and professionally accountable for the accuracy of the classification. Zuillda said, and then paused to let the dimensions of the gap between that standard and what Harvin Survey Associates had actually done become fully visible to everyone on the channel. The gap was considerable. Fenwell, Cullen, and Vale, Zuillda continued, conducted 1 orbital pass at Warp 6 on day 1, produced a data record that my analysis shows could not possibly have included surface sampling of any kind, given that the mission log shows the vessel never achieved low orbit, let alone surface approach, filed 3 paragraphs of biological assessment based entirely on that single orbital pass, and signed off on a sub-sentient classification that I am now standing on top of the consequences of, and I want to note that Fenwell's signature on the classification document includes his professional certification number, which means he staked his professional credentials on a classification that I could disprove without leaving this spot, and I have been standing in this spot for less than 4 hours. Fenwell, said Drex thoughtfully, sounds like a man who had somewhere else to be. Fenwell sounds like a man who had a quota and a schedule and a survey vessel that had better things to do than 30 days of surface sampling on a planet that the preliminary orbital data suggested wasn't going to produce anything biologically interesting. And I want to be fair to him, in the sense that the preliminary orbital data at Warp 6 would genuinely not have shown anything biologically interesting. Because Warp 6 transit sensor resolution is not capable of distinguishing a civilization from background geological noise, it's simply too fast for the sensors to build a meaningful picture, which is why the GSA standards require surface sampling rather than allowing orbital passes to substitute for it, Zuillda said. He knew the warp pass wasn't going to show him anything detailed, and he filed the report anyway, Voss said, and there was something in his voice that was not quite outrage but was in that neighborhood, the tone of someone arriving at a conclusion they don't entirely like. He filed a report that was consistent with what his orbital pass showed him, which was nothing complex, and he did not ask whether his orbital pass was capable of showing him something complex even if something complex was there, which is the question a thorough professional would have asked, and the answer to that question is that it was not capable of it. The sensor resolution at that velocity on a single pass simply cannot produce the biological complexity data that a classification requires. And Fenwell either knew that and filed the report anyway, or didn't know it and filed the report anyway, and I'm not sure which of those is worse, Zuillda said. It was 41 years ago, Caleb said, carefully, and survey standards and methodological requirements have evolved considerably in that period, and I think it would be worth noting that what constitutes an acceptable survey in the current regulatory environment may not reflect what was considered acceptable practice at the time the 7 Theta 9 survey was conducted. Caleb, Zuillda said, in the patient voice he used when he was about to say something that needed to be said, without the option of being unsaid afterward. I appreciate the effort to find a contextual framework that reduces the evidentiary weight of the methodology problems I am describing, and I understand why finding that framework would be useful to MEC's current legal position. But I want to tell you that I have reviewed the GSA survey standards that were in effect 41 years ago, because I anticipated this line of discussion and looked them up before I left the ship this morning, and the minimum surface sampling requirement for a Class M biological classification was 30 days and 100 sample sites in those standards too. And the requirement to supplement rather than replace surface sampling with orbital observation was explicitly stated in the version of the standards that was current when Fenwell filed his report. So the argument that standards have changed does not apply to the specific methodological failures I am identifying, because those failures were failures under the standards of their own time. The silence that followed this was the kind of silence that happens when a door closes on an argument and everyone in the room knows it. You looked up the historical standards before you left the ship, Drek said, not as a question, but as a statement being examined. I read the survey documentation last night after I reviewed my mission briefing, Zuillda said, and the methodology problems were visible on a first reading, and I felt it was worth understanding whether those problems would be evaluated against current standards or historical ones. So yes, I looked up the historical standards, because I am a thorough professional, and that is what thorough professionals do. And I want to note the contrast between my approach to preparing for this mission and the approach that Fenwell, Cullen, and Vale took to conducting it. He's been building this case since last night, Voss said to Drex quietly in the channel's background, with a tone that contained something Zuillda could not quite categorize, something that was not quite respect and was not quite irritation, but had elements of both. I heard that, Voss, Zuillda said. I know, Voss said, without embarrassment. There is one more aspect of the survey documentation I want to discuss, Zuillda said, shifting his attention back to his array readout, which was showing the 5th transect data coming in with the same exceptional mineral profile as all the others, the formation extending further in every direction than his initial estimates had suggested. And that is the geological section, because the geological section is, as I noted yesterday before deployment, the one part of this survey that is thorough, detailed, and professionally executed, and I want to talk about what that contrast tells us about the priorities of the survey team. The rocks were done properly, Drek said. The rocks were done exceptionally well, Zuillda said. The geological section of this survey is a genuinely impressive piece of field documentation. It has the depth and rigor and methodological care that you would expect from a team that was taking their work seriously. It has multiple orbital spectrographic passes and subsurface density mapping and trace element distribution analysis and detailed stratigraphic interpretation. It is by any measure a thoroughly professional geological assessment. And the contrast between that section and the 3 paragraphs of orbital past biological guesswork in the biology section is not a subtle contrast. It is the contrast between a team that cared about one specific question and was completely indifferent to all other questions. The question they cared about was whether the rocks were worth money, Voss said. The question they cared about was whether MEC's acquisition target was geologically viable, which is the question MEC was paying them to answer. And the answer to that question was yes, emphatically yes. The rocks are extraordinarily worth money, and having answered that question, they appear to have considered their work complete and filed a biological classification that was sufficient to clear the acquisition of any sentience-related complications without being sufficient in any other sense.
Zuillda said.
You're saying, Drex said, and his voice had arrived at a place that was genuinely sober now, not entirely without its characteristic lightness, but carrying something under it that had weight, that the survey team knew the rocks were exceptional, and they knew that a sentience finding would complicate or potentially block the acquisition. And they filed a sub-sentient classification on the basis of a single orbital pass at warp 6, because a proper survey might have found something that would have gotten in the way of the rocks. I am saying that the evidence is consistent with that interpretation, Zuillda said carefully, and I want to be precise that I am not asserting intent, because I cannot read the minds of people who filed a document 41 years ago, and I am not going to put something in my documentation that goes beyond what I can directly support. But I am saying that the pattern of thoroughness in the geological section, combined with the pattern of inadequacy in the biological section, is a pattern that is very difficult to explain by incompetence alone, because the team demonstrated that they were capable of thoroughness when they applied it to the geology, and the question of why they did not apply the same thoroughness to the biology is a question whose most straightforward answer I will leave to others to articulate. Nobody said anything for a moment, and the channel had the quality of a room in which something has been said that is going to be difficult to unsay, and everyone is adjusting to its presence. The 3 of them, Voss said eventually, Fenwell, Cullen, Vale, do you know if they're still working? Harvin Survey Associates dissolved 22 years ago, Zuillda said, and I have not looked up the individual team members, and I am not sure it is relevant to my documentation in any direct way, though I imagine MEC's legal team may have thoughts about that question that differ from mine. Caleb, Drex said, has the legal team said anything about the survey methodology question specifically, or are they still in the general review phase? They are reviewing the full situation, Caleb said, in the voice of a man who had received information he was not authorized to share and had chosen the phrasing that was most technically accurate while being least informationally useful. Caleb, Zuillda said, I want to ask you directly and I want a direct answer, and I am asking on the channel so that the question and whatever answer you give are both on the record. Has MEC Regional Operations indicated, in your call with them this morning or in any subsequent communication, that they intend to proceed with the extraction planning process for this planet, regardless of the biological findings I have been reporting today? The silence before Caleb's answer was 3 seconds long, which was 2 seconds longer than a comfortable silence, and 1 second shorter than a silence that had given up on being a comfortable silence and committed to being an uncomfortable one. MEC Regional Operations has indicated, Caleb said, that the extraction planning process will continue in accordance with the existing acquisition documentation and operational parameters while the legal review is ongoing, and that the legal review will determine whether any modifications to the operational plan are required, and that in the meantime all field assessment work should proceed as scheduled.
I see, Zuillda said.
Zuillda, Caleb began. No, Caleb, I understand, and I want to be clear that I am not surprised by that answer. I asked the question because I wanted the answer on the record, and I have it now. And I am going to continue my assessment work as directed and file my reports accurately and completely, and in full compliance with all applicable protocols, which is all I can do. And I want everyone on this channel to understand that when I say all applicable protocols, I mean all of them. Not just the MEC operational ones, but the GSA ones as well, because my professional obligations run to both, and I intend to honor both, and I want that intention clearly stated while we are all on the channel together, Zuillda said. What does that mean specifically? Drex asked, and his voice had the quality of someone who thought they might know what it meant and wanted to hear it said out loud. It means exactly what I said, Zuillda said, which is that I will file my reports accurately and completely and in compliance with all applicable protocols, and I think the specific implications of that will become clear when I file them, and I don't think there is anything more I need to say about it right now. He packed his geological array for the 5th time and began moving toward his 6th transect location, and the perimeter of 15 officers moved with him at their consistent 60-meter distance, and the settlement of 7 Theta 9 continued its disrupted morning around them all, and above it all the Meridian threshold hung in orbit, and the people on it sat with what had been said and what it meant, and Zuillda let them sit with it and kept working. Because the work was the point, and the work was not done, and there were 7 more transects to complete before the picture was complete enough to do what needed to be done with it. For what it's worth, Drex said eventually, and his voice was quieter than usual and had lost most of its performance quality, the quality of a man saying something he meant rather than something he had constructed for effect. I think Fenwell was a coward, and I think what he filed was garbage, and I think the people who accepted it without review should have known better, and I want that on record too. Noted, Zuillda said, and I mean that in the documented sense rather than the administrative sense.
Yeah, said Drex.
I know you do. The 6th transect location was inside the settlement proper, which had not been the original plan, but which had become unavoidable, as the formation's distribution pattern pushed his survey coordinates progressively further into the developed area, and Zuillda moved through the settlement's interior streets with the careful deliberateness of something that was trying very hard to be less alarming than it looked, which was an effort the laws of physics were declining to support with any enthusiasm. The streets here were wider than the peripheral pathways he had been working along all morning, surfaced with the same processed aggregate material as the main road, but maintained with a care that spoke to civic infrastructure of some organizational sophistication, with drainage channels cut into the margins, and what appeared to be deliberate lighting infrastructure mounted on regular intervals along the building faces, dark now in the daylight, but unmistakably intentional in their placement and construction. The buildings themselves were 2 and 3 stories in most cases, constructed from a combination of processed stone and timber materials with window apertures glazed in what his material analysis software identified as a silicate compound consistent with manufactured glass, and the overall impression was of a community that had moved well beyond the stage of simply keeping the weather out and had arrived at the stage of thinking about what it wanted its environment to look and feel like. Zuillda catalogued all of this in his running assessment documentation with the automatic thoroughness of a professional whose observational habits were by now entirely involuntary, and noted in particular the evidence of municipal organization visible in the street infrastructure, the consistency of building setbacks from the road edge, suggesting zoning or planning conventions of some kind, and the presence on several building faces of what appeared to be painted or carved symbolic markings that his cultural assessment software tentatively categorized as civic or commercial signage, all of which pointed in the same direction that everything else he had observed today pointed, which was toward a civilization that was considerably further along in its development than 3 paragraphs of orbital observation had suggested. The Thari population of the street had thinned considerably since his arrival in the area, which he attributed to a combination of the natural human analog response of removing yourself from proximity to something alarming and whatever guidance the institutional authorities had issued in response to the morning's events. And the result was a street that felt emptied rather than empty, with the particular quality of a space that normally contained a lot of people and was temporarily without them. The residue of recent activity, still present in the form of an overturned market stall near the corner of one of the subsidiary pathways, and a collection of personal items that had apparently been dropped and not retrieved by someone who had left in a hurry. He felt something about the dropped items that he did not immediately categorize and did not have time to examine, and filed it in the part of his awareness that was not the professional part and kept moving. The 15 officers maintained their perimeter with the admirable consistency that he had been noting in his documentation all morning, and he had developed a certain involuntary respect for their commitment to a job that must, by any measure, have been among the stranger jobs any of them had been asked to do. Because following a 3.8-meter exosuit through your own settlement, while it conducted what appeared to be some kind of systematic ground analysis, was not something that any law enforcement training program in the early industrial period of a civilization's development could possibly have prepared them for, and they were managing it with a professionalism that he found genuinely admirable and said so in his documentation. It was in the wider street near what his sensor mapping had identified as the settlement's administrative center, a cluster of larger and more formally constructed buildings around a paved open area that had the character of a civic space, that the encounter happened that changed the texture of the morning in ways that Zuillda had not anticipated and was not, when he examined his reactions afterward, entirely prepared for. He had been moving along the edge of the civic space, conducting his sensor sweep, when his audio array picked up a sound that his translation matrix, now operating at its partial 40% vocabulary coverage, flagged for attention, not because it was loud or urgent, but because it was different from the sounds the matrix had been processing all morning in a way that his system categorized as register shift. Specifically a shift from the adult communication register that had characterized all his audio captures so far to a register that the matrix identified as juvenile, and he turned toward the source of the sound and found himself looking at 4 young Thari individuals standing in the recessed entrance of a building at the edge of the civic space, looking back at him. They were, by his biological assessment software's estimation, between 6 and 10 years of age in whatever developmental timeline the Thari species followed, which his limited data suggested was broadly comparable to human analog species of similar complexity, and they were standing very close together in the way that young things stand together when they are uncertain, the 2 smallest ones slightly behind the 2 larger ones. All 4 of them looking at him with an intensity and a quality of attention that his behavioral analysis software processed for a moment before returning a categorization that stopped him in his tracks.
Curiosity.
Not fear or not primarily fear, though his software noted fear markers present in the physiological indicators it could read at this distance.
Primarily, unmistakably, curiosity.
The specific and focused curiosity of young entities whose instinct toward the unfamiliar had not yet been entirely overridden by the adult risk assessment response that was keeping every other Thari in this settlement at a careful distance. Threshold, Zuillda said, and his voice had a quality in it that was different from the professional register he had been maintaining all day, quieter and more careful, the voice of someone who has noticed something and doesn't want to disturb it. I am conducting a close-range biological assessment of a group of 4 juvenile Thari entities at approximately 8 meters distance, and I want to describe what I am observing for the record.
Go ahead, said Voss, and his voice had picked up the quality of Zuillda's, the careful quality, without apparently being aware that it had. They are juvenile, I estimate 6 to 10 years developmental age, 4 individuals, 2 larger and 2 smaller, standing together in a recessed building entrance at the edge of the settlement's apparent civic center, and they are observing me with what my behavioral analysis software is classifying primarily as curiosity rather than fear, though fear markers are present. And I want to note for the documentation that their response differs significantly from the adult response I have been observing all morning, which has been consistently fear and threat assessment dominant, and the difference is consistent with what you would expect from young entities whose learned caution responses are still in development, Zuillda said.
Kids are the same everywhere, Drex said, and his voice was entirely without irony or performance, which was the most surprising thing Drex had said all day. The biological complexity readings at this range are the clearest I have obtained today, Zuillda continued, running his scanner array through a careful passive sweep that he calibrated specifically to avoid any active emission that might register as threatening to the juveniles or anyone observing the encounter, and I am logging the morphological and neurological complexity indicators in detail because this is the best close-range data I am going to get. And I want to note that the neurological complexity indicators in particular are consistent with the upper range of my earlier sentience index estimate. The 72 to 78 range I reported previously is if anything conservative based on what I am reading at this distance. How conservative? Caleb asked, and there was something new in his voice when he asked it, something that had not been there before, a quality that was not quite the procedural careful manager voice and was not quite anything else Zuillda had a name for. Potentially 78 to 83 at this resolution, Zuillda said, which moves the Thari sentience classification from comfortably within the protected range to solidly within it. And I want to be clear that this refinement doesn't change the legal or ethical picture in any structural way, because the lower estimate was already well above the threshold, but it does sharpen the picture, and I think a sharper picture is what everyone should be working from. The largest of the 4 juveniles had taken a small step forward from the group while Zuillda was speaking, and was now standing slightly ahead of the others in a way that his behavioral software read as investigative approach, the specific body posture of a young entity that has decided that the interesting thing is worth the uncertainty of moving closer to it. And Zuillda went completely still in the way that you go still when something small and uncertain is considering whether to trust you, and you want to give it every possible reason to decide in favor of trust.
The juvenile said something.
His translation matrix processed the vocalization and returned 3 partial matches from its 40% coverage, words that came back as approximately big and approximately question marker and approximately name or identifier. And Zuillda looked at those three fragments and understood that the juvenile had asked him what he was, or possibly who he was, or possibly both. And that the question was being asked with the direct and unself-conscious curiosity of a young person who had not yet fully absorbed the adult consensus that the thing on their street was primarily a problem to be managed rather than a phenomenon to be understood. "I have a partial translation of the juvenile's vocalization," Zuillda said, maintaining his stillness and keeping his voice low enough that his external speaker output was at its minimum setting. "And the partial translation suggests they may have asked me what I am or who I am. And I want to note that this is the first communicative approach any Thari entity has made toward me today that was not accompanied by a projectile delivery system." "What are you going to do?" Voss asked. "I am going to do absolutely nothing that could be interpreted as threatening or aggressive, and I am going to let my translation matrix run on whatever they say, because even 40% coverage is better than nothing. And I am going to note in my documentation that the first voluntary communicative approach made to me by a Thari entity today was made by a child, which I think is a data point that belongs in the record," Zuillda said. "Zuillda," said Drex, "you can't talk to children on a per-contact planet. That's a Class 3 violation under." "I am aware of what it is under, Drex, and I am not initiating communication. I am receiving a communicative approach that has already been initiated by the juvenile entity, and there is a distinction in the protocol between initiated contact and received contact, and I am staying on the correct side of that distinction. And I would appreciate it if you let me manage this without commentary, because I am trying to concentrate on not doing anything alarming, and your voice in my ear is not helping with that," Zuillda said. Drex went quiet, which was itself a small event worth noting. The juvenile took another step forward and said something else, longer this time, and the translation matrix worked through it and returned a slightly better yield from the longer sample, something that approximated very big and something that might be suit or covering or shell, and something that was close enough to "Are you inside?" that Zuillda felt reasonably confident the juvenile was asking whether there was something inside the suit. Whether the suit itself was the entity or whether the entity was contained within it, which was, he reflected, an entirely reasonable question, and one that demonstrated a level of abstract reasoning that his behavioral software noted as above average for the developmental age estimate. "They appear to be asking whether I am inside the suit," Zuillda said, very quietly, which suggests a level of perceptual and inferential reasoning that I want to formally note in the documentation as further supporting evidence for the upper range of the sentience index estimate. Because the inference that a large mechanical object might contain a smaller biological entity rather than being a biological entity itself requires a certain quality of abstract thought that is not present in species below the confirmed sentient threshold. "Smart kid," said Voss quietly. "Apparently," Zuillda said. The two smaller juveniles had moved up alongside the larger one now, and all four were looking at him with the focused collective attention of a small committee that had decided to approach the question of what he was as a collaborative project. And he stood there and let them look and ran his passive scanner array and collected every piece of biological and behavioral data the array could gather without active emission, and filed all of it with the documentation tags that he had established for close-range sentience assessment, and felt, in the non-professional part of his awareness that had been running parallel to the professional part all morning, something that he was going to have to find a name for later when he had time. It was at this point that the administrator arrived. He had been tracking a signature approaching from the direction of the largest of the administrative buildings for several minutes, a single Thari entity moving with the purposeful and directed stride of someone who had decided they were going to do something and was en route to do it. And when the entity emerged into the civic space, and he got his first clear visual assessment, he updated his earlier behavioral categorization from approaching with intent to approaching with significant bureaucratic energy, because the entity was wearing what his cultural assessment software classified as formal institutional attire, and was carrying what appeared to be a collection of documents, and was projecting, even at 30 meters distance. The specific quality of a person who has a process and intends to follow it regardless of the circumstances. "I have a new contact," Zuillda said, a single Thari adult individual approaching from the administrative building cluster, wearing what appears to be formal institutional attire, carrying documents, and moving with a directed purposefulness that my behavioral software is categorizing as official engagement rather than threat response, which makes this entity distinct from every other adult Thari I have encountered today, and I am interested to see what they do." "What do they look like?" Drex asked, the performance quality back in his voice now that the quieter moment with the juveniles had been interrupted by something new. "They are of average Thari height and build. The attire is notably more formal than anything else I have observed in the settlement today. There appears to be some kind of insignia or marking on the upper garment that my cultural assessment software is tentatively categorizing as institutional rank indicator, and they are carrying what I estimate to be 6 to 8 individual documents of varying size, and their expression. As best as I can read it at this distance, and with the limited behavioral baseline I have for Thari facial communication, is the expression of a person who has a job to do and considers the job to be important," Zuillda said. "A bureaucrat," said Voss, with the fondness of someone who has recognized a kindred spirit at a distance. "Possibly," Zuillda said, "and if so they are the most courageous bureaucrat I have encountered in my professional career, because walking toward me with documents while 15 armed officers maintain a perimeter at 60 meters requires either significant institutional commitment or a genuinely remarkable absence of self-preservation instinct, and I am inclined to give them the benefit of the doubt and assume the former." The administrator and Zuillda had decided that was the working designation he was going to use, because it was the most accurate characterization his assessment could support, stopped at approximately 10 meters distance, and looked up at him with an expression that his behavioral software, now getting a clear facial read at close range, processed as the specific combination of determined and apprehensive that characterized people who had decided to do a difficult thing and were in the process of doing it before their apprehension could talk them out of it. The administrator said something, and the translation matrix processed it, and the yield was better than any translation return Zuillda had gotten all morning, because the administrator was speaking slowly and clearly in the manner of someone who was accustomed to being understood and wanted to ensure they were understood now, and the matrix pulled approximately 60% coverage from the sample, which was above its rated capability, and which Zuillda suspected was a function of the administrator's deliberate articulation more than any improvement in the matrix's performance. What came back was unknown entity, settlement authority, jurisdiction, document, comply, and what the matrix flagged as a strong possibility of the word trespass or unauthorized or violation. And Zuillda assembled these fragments into the most coherent interpretation. The data would support and arrived at the conclusion that the administrator was informing him that he was in violation of some municipal or jurisdictional regulation, and was being formally served with a document to that effect. "Threshold," Zuillda said, in the voice of a man who has found something so perfectly consistent with his own professional experience that he can only respond to it with the respect it deserves. "I want to report that I am being served with what appears to be a notice of municipal violation or trespass by a Thari administrative official who has approached me with formal documentation, while 15 armed officers maintain a perimeter and 4 juvenile entities observe from a doorway. And I want to note that this is, by a significant margin, the most relatable thing that has happened to me today." There was a pause, and then Drex said, "He's being issued a citation," and the laughter that followed was the broad, genuine kind, not the performed kind. Drex and Voss both, and Zuillda could hear Caleb making a sound in the background that was not quite laughter but was in the same family. "I want everyone to appreciate," Zuillda said, maintaining his stillness as the administrator held the document up toward him with both hands in a manner that was clearly intended to be formal and official, and was managing to be exactly that despite everything, that this individual has walked across an open civic space toward a 3.8-meter unknown entity that's shot at by the law enforcement community to hand me what is in all probability a trespass notice. And I want it in my documentation that the Thari administrative class demonstrates a commitment to institutional process that I find professionally admirable and personally somewhat humbling." "Are you going to take the document?" Voss asked. "I cannot take the document because my manipulator appendages in this suit are not calibrated for handling objects at the scale the document requires without significant risk of destroying it, and the irony of being issued a formal notice that I am physically incapable of receiving without damaging is not lost on me," Zuillda said, and extended one of his secondary manipulators toward the document as carefully as he could manage, which caused the administrator to take one sharp step backward before professional commitment reasserted itself, and they stepped forward again, and held the document out once more with the specific expression of someone who has made a decision and is sticking to it. "I am attempting to receive the document," Zuillda said, and the administrator is demonstrating what I can only describe as exceptional professional resolve in continuing to offer it despite everything about this interaction that would justify a different choice. And I want to formally commend their commitment to process under what are objectively very unusual circumstances. Zuillda, said Drex, with the quality of someone who had been laughing and had arrived at the other side of the laughter at a different place than he had started, I want to ask you something, and I want you to know I'm asking it seriously. Go ahead, Zuillda said, maintaining his careful focus on the document transfer attempt. When you look at these people, the administrator, the kids, the officers following you around all morning doing their jobs, what do you actually think about them? Not professionally, not for the documentation, just what do you actually think, Drex said. Zuillda was quiet for a moment. And the administrator stood in front of him with the document, and the 4 juveniles watched from their doorway, and the 15 officers held their perimeter, and the settlement of 7th, 8th, and 9 existed around all of them in the full complexity of a place where people lived and worked and built things, and taught their children and organized their civic spaces, and took their institutional responsibilities seriously even when the thing they were serving documents to was 3.8 meters tall and had no idea what the document said. I think, Zuillda said, carefully and honestly, that they are doing exactly what any rational species does when something unknown enters their environment, which is to say they are responding to it with the tools their civilization has developed for managing the unknown. And those tools include law enforcement and administrative process, and the specific bravery of curious children, and the specific different bravery of bureaucrats who believe in their institutions enough to serve trespass notices to things they have never seen before. And I think that the species that builds those kinds of tools and uses them in those kinds of circumstances is not a species that any honest assessment can describe as anything other than what it is, which is a people. And I think that is all I have to say about it that isn't already in my documentation. The channel was quiet for a long moment after that, and in the quiet the administrator slowly lowered the document and looked up at him, and whatever the administrator saw in the sensor cluster that served as Zuillda's face in this suit, it was apparently something that produced a response the translation matrix caught a fragment of, a single word that came back with unusual confidence given the matrix's general unreliability. A word that the matrix translated as something between waiting and what now and what happens next, and Zuillda thought that was probably the most accurate summary of the situation available in any language. I don't know, he said to the administrator through his external speaker at minimum volume, in his own language that they couldn't understand, because sometimes you answered a question even when the person asking it couldn't hear the answer. I genuinely don't know. The transmission from MEC Regional Operations came through while Zuillda was on his 7th transect, which was located in the southern quarter of the settlement, where the developed area thinned out into a mixed zone of light industrial structures, and what his cultural assessment software was categorizing as market or commercial exchange facilities. Low, wide buildings with open frontages that showed evidence of regular high-volume use in the wear patterns of their threshold surfaces and the accumulated material residue of ongoing commercial activity in their immediate surroundings. He had been collecting geological array data and biological samples and running his continuous electromagnetic analysis, and doing all of it while maintaining awareness of the officer perimeter and the administrator, who had followed him at a distance since the civic space encounter with the persistent and slightly forlorn quality of someone who had not achieved their objective and had not yet decided whether to try again or classify the attempt as a loss and move on. The transmission came through Caleb, as all formal MEC communications did, routed from the Regional Operations Center through the ship's comm array and down to Zuillda's suit receiver, and it was preceded by the specific 3-tone signal that MEC used to indicate a communication originating from a management-level source rather than an operational one. A distinction that Zuillda had learned in his first week at MEC meant that whatever followed was going to be delivered in a particular kind of language that had been reviewed by at least one person whose job title included the word communications or relations or both. Zuillda, Caleb said, with the careful tone of a handler introducing something he has concerns about, I have a live transmission from MEC Regional Operations Director Solon Price, who has requested a direct communication with you regarding the current assessment status. And I want to note before I connect you that Director Price has been briefed on the situation by the regional legal team and by MEC's acquisitions division, and is coming to this conversation with a specific set of priorities that I think it would be useful for you to be aware of going in. What priorities specifically? Zuillda said, pausing his geological array to give the conversation the attention it deserved, and watching his sensor tracking show the officer perimeter pausing with him in the coordinated way it had developed over the course of the morning. The officers apparently having concluded that, when he stopped moving, the appropriate response was to stop moving too, which was an adaptive tactical decision he continued to find professionally admirable. Director Prace's primary interest is in the geological assessment data and the extraction timeline implications, and his secondary interest is in understanding the biological situation well enough to brief MEC's board on exposure levels. And I want to be clear that, when I say secondary interest, I mean it is second in order of discussion rather than second in importance to the company. Because my understanding from the legal team's position as Prace described it to me is that the biological situation is actually the dominant concern from a liability standpoint, and the geological data, while extremely significant, is significant in the context of the biological situation rather than independently of it, Caleb said, and then paused in the way he paused when he had something else to say that he was deciding whether to say, and then said it. I also want to mention that Director Prace has a communication style that you may find somewhat different from the style of the operational conversations you and I have been having today, and I would ask you to engage with that style charitably and professionally. Caleb, Zuillda said, in 14 years of field assessment work, I have communicated with a considerable number of regional operations directors, and I have developed a working understanding of the communication style you are describing, and I want to assure you that I will engage with Director Prace with the full professionalism that my position requires. And I want you to note that I am saying this at the same time as I am standing in the middle of a settlement of 25,000 people on a planet with 1 billion inhabitants, while 15 officers maintain a perimeter around me, and an administrator follows me with an undeliverable trespass notice. So my definition of professionalism under difficult circumstances has been substantially refined today, and I think I can manage a conversation with a regional director. That's reassuring, Caleb said, in a tone that suggested it was partially reassuring at best. And then the transmission connected, and a new voice came onto the channel, a voice that had the specific quality that voices acquire when their owners have spent a long time in positions where other people listen carefully to what they say, a quality of practiced authority that sat in the lower register and moved at a considered pace and chose its words with the deliberateness of someone who understood that words. In their profession were instruments with precise functions rather than general-purpose communication tools. Zuillda, said Director Solon Prace, I'm connecting from regional operations, and I want to start by saying that the work you've been doing down there today has given us a picture that we didn't have this morning, and that picture is extremely valuable to the company regardless of the complexities it introduces. And I think it's important to acknowledge that before we get into the substance of what we need to discuss. Because the quality of your field work has been noted at the senior level, and that's not nothing. I appreciate that, Director, Zuillda said, in the neutral professional tone he reserved for conversations where the opening had been designed to create a particular emotional context, and he wanted to receive it without being shaped by it. Good, said Prace, moving forward with the efficiency of someone who had noted that the opening had landed without producing the warmth it was intended to produce, and had decided to proceed without it. Then let me get to the substance, which is that I've reviewed your preliminary findings in detail, and I want to confirm several key points so that we're working from the same understanding, and the first point is the geological data, which I want you to walk me through in your own words, because I've seen the numbers, and I want to hear the professional assessment behind them from the person who collected them. Zuillda walked him through the geological data. He did it thoroughly and accurately, and in the precise technical language that a proper geological assessment required, which meant that the conversation was, for approximately 8 minutes, a genuinely professional exchange between a field assessor and an operations director about subsurface mineral formation analysis, rare element concentration gradients, extraction depth profiles, and projected yield calculations. And during those 8 minutes, it was possible to inhabit the conversation as a straightforward professional discussion without the other things pressing in, and Zuillda inhabited it that way because it was the data he had collected, and the data deserved accurate representation regardless of what was going to happen around the edges of it. When he finished, Prace was quiet for a moment in the way that people are quiet when a number has confirmed what they hoped, and they are allowing themselves to register the confirmation before responding to it. And then he said, "Those are exceptional figures, Zuillda, and I want you to know that exceptional in this context means what you probably know it means in terms of where this deposit ranks against MEC's broader portfolio. And the board is going to receive this data, with a level of interest that will translate directly into operational priority for this asset. I understand, Zuillda said. Now, said Price, and his voice shifted in the way that voices shift when a conversation moves from the part that was comfortable to the part that requires more careful navigation. I want to discuss the biological findings, and I want to do that in a way that is direct and professional because I think that serves both of us better than anything else, and the direct and professional version is this. We have a situation on the ground that introduces complications into the operational picture, and I want to understand from you, as the qualified professional on the ground, what the realistic parameters of those complications are. Director, Zuillda said, and his voice had the quality of someone who has been waiting for a specific conversation to arrive and is ready for it. I want to engage with that question honestly and completely, and the honest and complete answer requires me to use specific terminology rather than the word complications, because I think precision serves both of us better in this context, and the precise description of what I have found today is as follows. The planet designated MEC-Catalogue 7-Theta-9 supports an intelligent species that I have designated the Thari, with a population of between 900 million and 1.2 billion individual entities, a galactic sentience index score of between 78 and 83 based on my most recent close-range assessment, a functioning civilization at approximately the early industrial development stage, and all the characteristics of social, institutional, and cultural complexity that accompany a species at that developmental level, and under Galactic Survey Authority, code those findings do not introduce complications into the operational picture. They fundamentally alter the operational picture in ways that cannot be characterized as complications because that word implies something that can be worked around, and what I am describing cannot be worked around. There was a silence, and Zuillda had the sense of a person on the other end of a transmission recalibrating their approach in real time, the sense of practiced authority encountering data that its practiced approach was not fully equipped to process and taking a moment to find new footing. I appreciate the precision, Price said eventually, and his voice had found its footing again, on ground that Zuillda recognized as the ground of someone who has been briefed by a legal team and is deploying that briefing, and I want to engage with it in kind, which means I want to be direct about MEC's legal position as the acquisitions team and the legal review have characterized it. And that position is that the acquisition of 7-Theta-9 was conducted in full compliance with the regulatory framework that was in effect at the time of acquisition, that the survey documentation filed with MEC regional operations met the acceptance standards applied to survey documentation at the time of its filing, and that MEC's legal claim to this asset is grounded in 41 years of uncontested documentation that establishes our operational rights under the existing acquisition framework, and that while the biological findings you are reporting today are significant and will be fully incorporated into our operational planning, they do not in MEC's legal assessment retroactively invalidate the acquisition basis or the operational rights that flow from it. Zuillda let this sit for a moment, not because he was surprised by it, because he was not surprised by it at all, but because it deserved a moment of genuine consideration before he responded to it, and because the considerations it deserved were ones he wanted to be sure he had properly examined before he articulated them on a channel that he knew was being recorded at both ends. Director Price, Zuillda said, I want to respond to what you've just said in the same spirit of directness and professionalism that you offered it in, and I want to start by acknowledging that the legal position you have described is a coherent legal position that I understand and that I am not disputing on its own terms, because I am a field assessor and not a lawyer and the specific legal analysis is not my domain, and I am going to stay in my domain, which is the scientific and professional assessment domain, and in that domain I want to be clear about several things. Go ahead, said Price. The first thing I want to be clear about is that the Thari Sentience Index score of 78 to 83 places this species in the same general range as several species that are currently full members of the Galactic Survey Authority's Protected Species Register, and that the characteristics I have observed and documented today are consistent with, and in some respects exceed the complexity profiles of those registered species. Which means that the scientific basis for Thari protected classification is not a marginal or debatable finding, but a robust and well-supported one that I am prepared to defend to the full professional standard required by any review process, Zuillda said, moving his geological array to its next sample point, and deploying it with the automatic efficiency of someone who has done this enough times that the physical part of the work runs independently of the cognitive part. And the second thing I want to be clear about is that MEC's legal position, as you have described it, rests on the validity of the original survey documentation. And I have examined that documentation in considerable detail today, and I have significant professional concerns about its methodological basis that I have been documenting throughout this assessment, and that I intend to include in my final report. And those concerns are concerns about the adequacy of the survey against the standards of its own time, not against current standards, which I think is a distinction that MEC's legal team will want to be very clear about before they commit to a position that depends on the documentation's validity. Price was quiet again, and this time the quality of the quiet was the quality of a person who has received information that has affected the ground their position is standing on and is assessing the new stability of that ground. You're saying the survey doesn't hold up against its own period's standards, Price said. I am saying that the biological assessment component of the survey does not meet the minimum methodological requirements established by the GSA standards that were in effect at the time of its filing, yes, and I am saying that I have documented this finding in detail, and that the documentation includes a comparison between what the standards required and what the survey actually contains, and that comparison is not favorable to the survey, Zuillda said. That's a significant claim, Price said. It is a claim that I would not make if I were not prepared to support it fully with documented evidence, Director, because my professional reputation is what I have, and I do not stake it on claims I cannot support. And I want to note that the evidence I am describing is contained in MEC's own archived survey documentation, and is therefore available to anyone who chooses to look at it carefully. And the reason I am the one describing it today is simply that I am the first person in 41 years who has looked at it carefully, which is a situation that MEC's legal team may also want to factor into their position, Zuillda said. The channel had gone very quiet, and Zuillda could hear in the background of the transmission the ambient sounds of a regional operations center, voices and equipment, the ordinary sounds of a large organization going about its business, and he thought about the distance between that ordinary institutional background and the civic space where an administrator had tried to serve him a trespass notice while children watched. And he thought about what the connection was between those two places and what flowed along that connection, and he kept his voice level and professional and waited. Zuillda, Price said, and his voice had arrived somewhere new, had shed the practiced authority register, and was speaking from something more direct underneath it. I want to ask you a question off the record. I want to note, Zuillda said, that I don't have an off-the-record setting. My suit recorder is running continuously as required by GSA field assessment protocol, and everything said on this channel is captured in that record. And I am telling you this because I want you to make an informed decision about what you say next rather than saying something under the impression of privacy that the actual situation does not provide. There was a pause, and then Price said, "Of course," in a voice that had reclosed around its practice quality, and then said, "I'll have my team follow up with Caleb on the timeline for your final report, and I want to say again that the quality of your fieldwork today has been noted, and we'll be in touch." And the transmission ended with the three-tone signal that bookended all management-level communications and left the channel with the quality of a room after someone significant has left it. Nobody said anything for a moment. "Drex," Zuillda said. "Yeah," said Drex. "What is MEC going to do?" Zuillda said, not as a question but as a statement that had a question's shape, because he knew the answer and he was putting it on the channel because he wanted to hear what Drex said when he answered it honestly. And Drex said things honestly when they were past the point of performance. "They're going to proceed," Drex said, without the usual texture of his voice, flat and certain. "They're going to take the legal position that the acquisition stands, and they're going to advance the extraction timeline, and they're going to deal with the biological question in whatever way their legal team thinks gives them the most cover. And the fact that you've documented everything today the way you have is going to matter to somebody somewhere, but it's not going to be the somebody who makes the decision about this planet. Because the somebody who makes that decision is going to be looking at your geological numbers and thinking about what those numbers mean for the company's position and their own position and the board's position. And the THARI are going to be a line item in the risk assessment rather than the point of the conversation." "Yes," Zuillda said. "That is what I thought." "Does it change what you're going to do?" Drex asked. "No," Zuillda said, "it doesn't change what I'm going to do. And I want to be clear that the reason it doesn't change what I'm going to do is not stubbornness or any kind of gesture. It's simply that what I'm going to do is file an accurate and complete report in full compliance with all applicable protocols. And whether MEC proceeds or doesn't proceed doesn't change what accurate and complete means or what all applicable protocols requires." Those things are defined independently of what MEC intends, and I intend to meet the definitions. All applicable protocols, Voss said, with the quality he had used when he said it before, the quality of someone who has been thinking about what that phrase means and has arrived at a fairly clear idea. All applicable protocols, Zuillda confirmed, and packed his geological array and moved to his 8th transect location, and the officer perimeter moved with him, and the administrator followed at their distance, and above him in orbit the meridian threshold held its position. And in a regional operations center somewhere in the network of MEC's institutional infrastructure director, Solon Price, was making calls to people whose decisions would matter enormously to a billion people who had no idea those decisions were being made. And Zuillda walked through their settlement and collected his data and thought about what accurate and complete meant and what all applicable protocols required and what he was going to do about both when the time came. For what it's worth, said Caleb, in a voice that had shed most of its procedural careful quality and was speaking from somewhere underneath it that Zuillda had not heard from Caleb before, I think the survey was garbage, and I think Price knows the survey was garbage, and I think the legal team knows the survey was garbage, and I think everyone who has looked at it today knows what it was and what it wasn't, and I want that on the channel record. Zuillda stopped walking for a moment. Thank you, Caleb, he said. Don't thank me, Caleb said, the procedural voice coming back over the other one like a door closing carefully rather than slamming. I have 17 forms to file before end of shift, and at least 4 of them are your fault. Noted, Zuillda said, and kept walking, and somewhere under the professional register of his voice was something that was not quite a smile but was in the same neighborhood, and he let it be there without examining it too closely because there was still work to do, and the work required his full attention, and he was, whatever else was true about today, a professional, and that was not going to change regardless of anything. The 8th transect was the last one that fell within the settlement boundary, and after it, the remaining survey coordinates took him back out through the settlement's northern edge into the agricultural margins, and then beyond into the open terrain where the geology was cleaner and the data collection was straightforward and nobody was going to shoot at him. A prospect that his nervous system was receiving with considerably more enthusiasm than his professional obligations technically required him to express. He had been on the surface of 7 Theta 9 for a little over 9 hours by this point, and in those 9 hours he had been shot at 4 times, served with a municipal violation, notice he couldn't read, followed by 15 law enforcement officers and 1 administrator with unrequited documentary ambitions, observed by 4 children whose curiosity had affected him more than he was going to put in any report, and had a conversation with a regional operations director whose subtext had been louder than his text in ways that Zuillda had been thinking about ever since the transmission ended. The officer perimeter had thinned over the course of the afternoon. 3 of the 15 had apparently been reassigned, or had reached the end of whatever shift structure the Thari law enforcement institution operated on, because their signatures had dropped off his sensor tracking at regular intervals without being replaced, leaving 12, and then 10, and currently 9 officers maintaining the perimeter with the somewhat reduced energy of people who had been doing the same thing for many hours and had not yet been relieved of the responsibility. He found himself hoping, in the non-professional part of his awareness, that they were going to get a meal at some point, and noted the hope without commenting on it. The administrator had gone back to the administrative building cluster an hour after the civic space encounter and had not reappeared, and Zuillda had catalogued their departure in his documentation as the conclusion of the first formal administrative contact event with a Thari institutional representative, which he recognized was a characterization that made the trespass notice attempt sound considerably more dignified than a trespass notice attempt, but which was also, he felt, the accurate professional framing of what had actually happened, because the administrator had attempted to apply their institutional framework to an unprecedented situation using the tools their institution had given them, and that deserved accurate documentation rather than condescension. He was packing his 8th transect array and preparing to move to the northern edge of the settlement when Caleb came onto the channel with the quality he had when he was carrying something heavy and had decided that carrying it alone was no longer practical. Zuillda, Caleb said, I need to brief you on communications I have received from MEC Regional Operations in the 2 hours since Director Price's call, and I want to do that now rather than waiting until you are back on the ship, because I think the content is relevant to your remaining field time, and I want you to have it while you can still act on it if you choose to. Go ahead, Zuillda said, and began moving toward the northern edge of the settlement, at a pace that his sensor tracking showed the remaining 9 officers adjusting to with the weary professionalism of a long shift's end. MEC Regional Operations has completed its initial legal review of the 7 Theta 9 situation and has communicated their position and their operational intentions to this ship, and I am going to read you the relevant sections of that communication in the precise language in which they were written, because I think the precise language matters, and I don't want to be accused of characterizing it inaccurately, Caleb said. And there was in his voice the quality of a man reading from a document he has read several times already, and whose relationship with the document has not improved with repetition. The communication states, and I am quoting directly, MEC Regional Operations has reviewed the field assessment data transmitted by Assessor Zuillda from MEC-Catalogue 7 Theta 9 and has conducted a comprehensive legal analysis of the acquisition status, operational rights, and biological findings in consultation with MEC's senior legal team and acquisitions division leadership. Following that review, MEC Regional Operations confirms that the acquisition of MEC-Catalogue 7 Theta 9 is legally valid and operationally current under the terms of MEC's standard acquisition framework, and that the extraction planning process for this asset will proceed in accordance with the approved operational timeline. MEC acknowledges the biological assessment findings submitted by Assessor Zuillda and notes that those findings are being incorporated into MEC's operational risk assessment framework. Pre-extraction orbital infrastructure deployment has been authorized and is scheduled to commence in 16 months, with surface operations projected to begin at month 18 of the current operational timeline. Assessor Zuillda is directed to complete his geological assessment, file his final resources report, and return to the ship at the conclusion of his field work, Caleb said, and then stopped reading and was quiet in the way of a person who has delivered a thing and is waiting to see what it does when it lands. The channel was quiet for a moment, and the settlement of 7 Theta 9 moved around Zuillda in the late afternoon light, the long shadows of the buildings reaching across the streets, and the sounds of the community going about what remained of its day filtering through his audio sensors with the full texture of a place that was alive and ongoing and entirely unaware of what had just been read out on a comm channel 9 hours into a survey of its subsurface geology. Caleb, Zuillda said, in a voice of complete professional composure, that he was maintaining through the specific effort that complete professional composure requires when what you are composing is something that would very much prefer not to be composed. I want to confirm that I have understood the communication correctly, and I am going to restate my understanding and ask you to correct me if I have got anything wrong. Because I want to be absolutely certain about what MEC Regional Operations has decided before I respond to it. Go ahead, Caleb said. MEC Regional Operations has reviewed the finding that this planet supports an intelligent species with a population of between 900 million and 1.2 billion individual entities, a sentience index score of 78 to 83, and a functioning civilization at the early industrial development stage. And having reviewed that finding, they have decided that extraction operations will proceed on a timeline that begins orbital infrastructure deployment in 16 months and surface operations in 18 months, and that the biological findings have been, in their precise language, incorporated into MEC's operational risk assessment framework, which is a phrase that I want to examine for a moment, because I want to understand what it means in practical terms, Zuillda said. I believe it means, Caleb said carefully, that the legal and acquisitions teams have assessed the biological findings as a risk factor to be managed within the operational plan, rather than as a factor that alters the fundamental decision about whether to proceed. A risk factor to be managed, Zuillda said. That is the language the communication uses, yes, Caleb said. Drex, Zuillda said. I'm here, Drex said, and his voice had none of its usual qualities, none of the ease or the performance or the readiness to be entertained, just the flat and present quality of someone who is paying complete attention. When MEC's operational plan for a planetary extraction asset proceeds to the surface operations phase on a planet that has 1 billion people on it, and no one has told those people anything about what is coming, and when the communication describing that plan characterizes the 1 billion people as a risk factor to be managed, I want you to tell me, in plain language, and without any of the packaging that we normally put around difficult things in professional communications. What you think that means for the 1 billion people, Zuillda said. The silence that followed was not the silence of people composing answers. It was the silence of people who knew the answer and were sitting with knowing it. You know what it means, Drex said eventually. I know what it means, Zuillda said. I want someone else to say it. It means, Voss said, and his voice had the quality of someone speaking carefully because the words are heavy and they want to carry them accurately, that MEC intends to extract the resources from this planet on their timeline regardless of the Thari population, and that the operational plan does not include any provision for what happens to 1 billion people when a full-scale extraction operation begins on the planet they live on. And that characterizing them as a risk factor means that the question MEC's legal and operational teams have been working on is not what happens to the Thari, but what happens to MEC if the Thari situation becomes a liability, which is a very different question with very different answers. Yes, Zuillda said. That is what it means. Caleb, Drex said, with a directness that was different from his usual manner with Caleb, stripped of the lazy authority he normally deployed in speaking instead with the directness of someone who wants a straight answer and is not going to accept a procedural substitute for one. Did the communication from regional operations include any mention of Galactic Survey Authority notification requirements, or any reference to the GSA Protected Species protocols? Or any indication that MEC intends to fulfill the mandatory contact and assessment review obligations that are triggered by Zuillda's biological findings? The communication did not include any specific reference to GSA notification requirements or protected species protocols, Caleb said, in a voice that had become very precise and very careful in the way that voices become when their owner is aware that what they are saying is being recorded and may be read by people who are not currently on the channel. It didn't mention the GSA at all, Drex said. The communication did not mention the Galactic Survey Authority in any context, Caleb said. That's interesting, Drex said, because my understanding, and I want to be clear that I'm not a regulatory specialist and Zuillda should correct me if I'm wrong, is that the GSA mandatory notification for a sentience finding above the 10,000 entity threshold is not an optional step that companies can choose to include or exclude from their operational planning. It is a legal obligation that attaches to the finding itself regardless of what the company that commissioned the assessment intends to do about the finding, and that the obligation to notify the GSA rests not just on MEC as the commissioning company, but on the individual assessor who made the finding. And I am saying this out loud on the channel because I think it is information that everyone should have, and I want it in the record that I said it. Your understanding, Zuillda said, with the quality of a professor confirming a student's accurate recitation of a difficult principle, is entirely correct, and I appreciate you articulating it clearly for the record, and I want to add to your articulation the specific regulatory language, which is that under GSA Survey Code Section 9, Paragraph 4. Any qualified field assessor who documents a sentience finding meeting or exceeding the minimum threshold is required to file a formal sentience assessment report directly with the Galactic Survey Authority within 72 hours of the finding, and that the filing requirement is independent of and in addition to any reporting obligations to the commissioning company, and that failure to file within the 72-hour window is a professional violation that can result in assessor decertification. And that filing within the window is a professional obligation that no instruction from a commissioning company can legally override. 72 hours, Voss said. From the time of the finding, Zuillda confirmed. When was your finding? Voss said, with the quality of someone doing arithmetic whose answer they already know. My preliminary sentience finding, at the threshold that triggers the filing requirement, was made approximately 9 hours and 40 minutes ago, when my biological complexity assessment first returned data consistent with confirmed sentient classification, Zuillda said, which means I have approximately 62 hours and 20 minutes remaining in my filing window. Which is a comfortable margin, and I want to note that I have been aware of this obligation and this timeline throughout the day and have been managing my documentation accordingly. Zuillda, Caleb said, with the voice of a man standing at a junction he has been able to see coming for several hours and has not been able to figure out how to avoid. I need to ask you directly, and I need to ask it as a question about your intentions rather than as a question about regulatory requirements, because the regulatory requirements are clear and I understand them, and what I need to understand is what you intend to do. Caleb, Zuillda said, with the same directness, I intend to complete my geological assessment, file my final resources report to MEC as directed, and simultaneously file my sentience assessment report to the Galactic Survey Authority within the 72-hour window required by GSA Survey Code, and I want to be clear that I am not framing this as a choice or a decision, because it is not a choice or a decision. It is a professional obligation that I am legally and professionally required to fulfill, and the question of whether MEC regional operations would prefer I not fulfill it is a question that does not have any bearing on whether I fulfill it, because my professional obligations do not have an opt-out provision for cases where the commissioning company finds the obligation inconvenient. Regional operations is going to have a significant response to that, Caleb said. Regional operations is welcome to have whatever response they like, Zuillda said, and I will engage with that response professionally and thoroughly when it arrives. And in the meantime, I have 2 transects remaining, and I intend to complete them because my geological assessment is not yet finished, and I am a professional, and I finish what I start. I want to ask something, Voss said, with the tone he used when he had been thinking about something for a while and had decided to put it into words. And the question is about the GSA filing and what it actually does mechanically when you file it, because I want to understand what happens after. When a sentience assessment report is filed with the Galactic Survey Authority, Zuillda said, moving through the settlement's northern edge now where the buildings were thinning and the agricultural margins were reappearing, the 9 remaining officers maintaining their perimeter in the long light of the late afternoon with the stoic persistence that had characterized them all day. The GSA's automated intake system logs the filing and issues a case number, and then several things happen in sequence. The first of which is that an automated freeze notice is issued to all parties listed in the planetary acquisition record for the planet in question, which in this case means MEC, and the freeze notice suspends all pending operational activities related to the planet pending the outcome of the sentience assessment review. And the second thing that happens is that the original survey documentation for the planet is automatically flagged for methodology review. And the third thing that happens is that the GSA's First Contact Protocol Division is notified, and a First Contact Assessment Team is assigned to the case, and all of these things happen automatically upon filing and cannot be reversed or suspended by any party other than the GSA itself. The freeze notice goes to MEC automatically, Drek said. Upon filing, yes, Zuillda said. And it suspends the extraction timeline, Drek said. All pending operational activities related to the planet, yes, which includes the pre-extraction orbital infrastructure deployment authorized by MEC Regional Operations approximately 2 hours ago, Zuillda said. So the 16-month deployment timeline, Voss said, goes away. The freeze notice would suspend it pending the review outcome, yes, Zuillda said, and the review process for a sentience finding of this complexity and population scale has a minimum duration that I estimate at several years, and the outcome of the review, given the biological data I have documented today and the methodology questions I have raised about the original survey, is not something I would characterize as uncertain. And MEC can't stop you from filing, Drek said. MEC cannot legally instruct me not to file, because the filing obligation is a personal professional obligation that sits outside my employment relationship with MEC and is governed by my assessor certification rather than my contract, and any instruction from MEC that attempted to prevent me from fulfilling a GSA-mandated filing requirement would itself constitute a regulatory violation on MEC's part, which I think their legal team is aware of. Which is possibly why Director Prace's communication carefully avoided mentioning the GSA at all rather than explicitly instructing me not to file, Zuillda said. He was hoping you wouldn't notice the obligation, Voss said. Or hoping I would notice it and choose professional self-preservation over professional obligation, which is a calculation that people in positions like Prace's sometimes make about people in positions like mine, and which in this case has not produced the outcome he may have been hoping for, Zuillda said. Zuillda, Drek said, and his voice was entirely stripped of everything now, none of the ease or the entertainment, or the reflexive distance that characterized most of what he said, speaking from whatever was underneath all of that with a directness that Zuillda had not heard from him in the 2 weeks since he had come aboard. I want to say something to you, and I want you to receive it as what it is, which is an honest thing said by a person who has not been, if we are being truthful about it, particularly decent to you since you came on this ship. And the thing I want to say is that what you are doing is the right thing, and that I know it is going to cost you something professionally with MEC regardless of whether your obligations protect you from the worst of it, and that I think you know that and you are doing it anyway, and I want to say that I think that is the correct decision and I respect it. Zuillda walked in silence for a moment through the last of the settlement's northern edge, past the final structures and into the agricultural margins, where the crops were catching the low afternoon light, and the soil under his feet was sitting above one of the most extraordinary mineral deposits he had ever surveyed. And the 9 officers walked with him at their 60 meters, and the settlement receded behind him with all its roads and buildings and glass windows and civic spaces, and children in doorways and administrators with undeliverable documents, all of it going about the end of its day with the complete and ordinary confidence of a place that expected tomorrow to arrive.
"Drex," Zuillda said. "Yeah," said Drex.
"I've been 4th on the list before," Zuillda said, "and I imagine I will be 4th on the list again after this, and I want to be clear that I don't particularly enjoy it, but I have been doing this work for 14 years, and in 14 years I have filed accurate reports, and I have met my professional obligations, and I have not once submitted a document that said something other than what the data supported. And I don't intend to start today because a regional operations director has a preferred outcome and a legal team that is working hard to construct a framework around it. And the reason I don't intend to start today is not heroism or stubbornness. It is simply that I am a professional, and that is what professionals do, and the Thari are what they are regardless of what any document says about them or doesn't say about them, and the data I have collected today says what it says. And I am going to file it." Nobody said anything for a moment, and the channel had a quality to it that it had not had since Zuillda had come aboard the threshold, a quality of people being in the same place and meaning it rather than simply occupying the same operational frequency, and Zuillda noted it without examining it too closely because he had 2 transects remaining, and the light was going to be gone in 3 hours, and he needed the data from both before he could put together a complete picture. "Also," Zuillda said, "because the channel needed something and he had something available, I want to formally note that I have now been followed for 9 hours and 40 minutes by law enforcement officers who have not been relieved for a meal break or a rest period, and who have maintained their perimeter with complete professionalism throughout. And I want it in my documentation that the Thari institutional commitment to duty under extended and unprecedented operational conditions is, by any civilizational complexity metric, exemplary, and that whoever is running their law enforcement training program is doing an excellent job." The sound that came out of Drex was genuine laughter, the real kind, the kind that surprises the person doing it, and it was followed immediately by Voss doing the same, and even Caleb made the sound that was not quite laughter, but had given up pretending it was something else entirely. And Zuillda walked out into the open terrain of 7 Theta 9, with the last of the afternoon light on the extraordinary geology beneath his feet and the sounds of people laughing in his ear, and the 9 officers falling back at the settlement's edge because they had apparently reached the limit of their jurisdiction. And he thought that all things considered, and there were a great many things to consider, today had been one of the more significant days of his professional career, and that the work was almost done. And that what came after the work was going to matter enormously, and that he was ready for it. The 9th and 10th transects were the cleanest data collection of the entire day, which Zuillda attributed partly to the absence of law enforcement perimeters and municipal administrators, and partly to the fact that the open terrain north of the settlement sat above the deepest and most concentrated section of the formation he had been mapping all day, the geological equivalent of finding the center of something after spending hours working around its edges. The subsurface readings here were extraordinary even by the standard that the day's earlier readings had established as extraordinary, and he collected the data with the thoroughness it deserved and filed it in his running resources report with the automatic precision of someone who has been doing this long enough that quality of execution is not something that requires conscious effort. It is simply what work looks like when it comes out of hands that know what they are doing. He completed the 10th transect as the light was failing, the sun of 7 Theta 9 dropping toward the horizon with the particular quality of light that late afternoons have on planets with slightly thicker atmospheres than standard, a warm and heavy quality that caught the agricultural land around him and made the cultivated fields look like something someone had painted rather than something that had grown. And he stood in the middle of it and ran his final sensor sweeps and collected his last samples and let his documentation system pull everything together into the preliminary resources report that was the primary deliverable of his mission. And when the report compiled, he read it through once from beginning to end with the focused attention he gave to every document he produced before he signed his certification to it. It was, by any honest professional assessment, an exceptional report. The geological data was thorough and precise, and documented to a standard that significantly exceeded the minimum requirements of his contract and of the GSA field assessment guidelines, because he had been doing thorough and precise work for 14 years, and he did not know how to do it any other way. The mineral formation he had characterized was one of the most significant finds in his career, and the report said so, accurately and without inflation, with the specific technical language that qualified the claim and the data that supported it. And any extraction planning team that received the report would have everything they needed to understand exactly what was in the ground beneath 7-9 and exactly what it would take to get it out. He signed his professional certification to the resources report and queued it for transmission, and then he opened his sentience assessment documentation and read through that from beginning to end as well. And the sentience assessment documentation was, if anything, more thorough than the resources report, because he had been adding to it all day, and it contained everything, every biological sample reading, every behavioral observation, every electromagnetic signal analysis, every population density extrapolation, every cultural complexity indicator, every close-range neurological scan, the administrator, the officers, the children in the doorway, all of it documented with the same precision and the same care and the same professional certification that he brought to the rocks, because the Thari deserved the same quality of documentation that the rocks received, and he had made sure they got it. He read it through and he checked every data point, and every citation, and every cross-reference to GSA protocol, and every application of GSA survey code to the findings it governed. And when he was satisfied that it was accurate and complete and professionally unassailable, he queued it for transmission alongside the resources report, and then he opened his pre-deployment concern notation, which had reached 31 items over the course of the day. And he read through that as well and added 3 items he had been holding in reserve, items 32 through 34, which addressed the translation matrix calibration failure, the suit acoustic profile and its impact on operational security, and the systematic relationship between the original survey's methodological failures and the operational conditions he had been working in all day, and he certified that document too and added it to the transmission queue. Threshold, Zuillda said, beginning the walk back toward his original landing coordinates where the drop pod was waiting to take him home. I am completing my field work and preparing to transmit my final documentation package, and I want to walk you through what I am transmitting, because I think it is important that everyone on the channel understands what is going out and where it is going before it goes. We're listening, said Drex, and the channel had the quality it had developed over the last few hours, the quality of people paying genuine attention rather than monitoring an operational frequency. I am transmitting 3 documents, Zuillda said, moving through the agricultural margins in the fading light with the exosuit producing its hydraulic commentary at the reduced volume of a suit whose systems had been running for 12 hours and were beginning to express their fatigue in the only language available to them. The first of which is my preliminary geological resources report for MEC-Catalogue 7-9, which I am transmitting to MEC Regional Operations as directed by the operational parameters of this mission and as required by my contract, and that report contains the complete geological assessment data from all 10 transects and the full characterization of the subsurface mineral formation, including yield projections and extraction depth profiles. And it is a thorough and accurate document that MEC's extraction planning team can use immediately and that I am professionally satisfied with. And the other too, Voss said. The second document is my sentience assessment report for the species I have designated the Thari, inhabitants of MEC-Catalogue 7-9, which I am filing with the Galactic Survey Authority in fulfillment of the mandatory reporting obligation under GSA Survey Code Section 9, Paragraph 4, within the 72-hour window required by that code, and that report contains the complete biological, behavioral, cultural, and neurological assessment data I have collected today, the population estimates with their methodology and error margins, the sentience index scoring with its supporting data, the civilizational complexity assessment, and my formal professional recommendation for Thari classification as a protected developing species under the GSA Protected Species Register, Zuillda said, and paused to let that settle before continuing. And I want to note for the record that this transmission goes directly to the GSA's intake system and does not route through MEC regional operations or through this ship, and that upon receipt, the GSA's automated systems will issue a freeze notice to all parties in the 7-9 acquisition record and flag the original survey documentation for methodology review, and that these outcomes occur automatically and cannot be reversed by any party other than the GSA itself. The channel was quiet with the quality of people absorbing something they knew was coming and finding that knowing it was coming did not fully prepare you for it actually arriving. The third document, Zuillda continued, is my pre-deployment and in-mission concern notation, which currently contains 34 items and which I am filing with MEC's Regional Operations Compliance Division, as well as with the GSA's Field Assessment Standards Office. Because several of the items in the notation, relate to equipment and operational planning failures that have implications for GSA field assessment protocol compliance, and are therefore within the GSA Standards Office's oversight jurisdiction. And I want to note that the notation includes my professional assessment of the original survey documentation's methodological adequacy against the standards of its own time, which I am filing as a formal professional opinion rather than as a legal finding. Because I am not a lawyer, but I am a qualified field assessor with 14 years of experience, and my professional opinion on survey methodology is something I am entitled to put on record. 34 items, Voss said, with the tone of someone honoring a number. 34, Zuillda confirmed, and I want to be clear that every item is documented with specific evidence and cross-reference to the relevant standard or protocol it bears on, and that the document is not an expression of frustration, though frustration would have been entirely justified. It is a professional assessment of professional failures, and it is the most thoroughly sourced thing I have produced today, which, given the quality of the rest of today's documentation, is not a low bar. Caleb, said Drex, I need to ask you something, and I need you to answer it honestly rather than procedurally, because I think we are past the point where procedural answers serve anyone, and the question is this. When Zuillda files these documents, and the GSA freeze notice goes out to MEC, what happens to Zuillda professionally? Caleb was quiet for a moment, and the quiet had the quality of a person doing an honest assessment of something they would prefer to assess optimistically, but cannot. In the short term, Caleb said carefully, MEC regional operations will almost certainly initiate a contract review, and the contract review will examine whether Zuillda's conduct today, specifically the GSA filing and the methodology assessment in the concern notation, constitutes grounds for contract termination under MEC's standard field assessor agreement. And the specific grounds they will look at are the clauses relating to conduct inconsistent with company interests and disclosure of proprietary assessment data to third parties. And I want to be honest that those clauses are broadly written, and MEC's legal team is very good at finding the interpretation of broadly written clauses that serves the company's position. So they'll try to terminate his contract, Drex said. They will examine whether they can, yes, Caleb said. Can they, Drex said. The GSA filing obligation is explicitly carved out of the standard confidentiality and disclosure provisions in MEC's field assessor contracts, because the GSA insisted on that carve-out as a condition of certifying MEC assessors. So the disclosure argument is weak, Caleb said, and the conduct inconsistent with company interests clause has never been successfully applied to mandatory regulatory filings in any arbitration I am aware of. Which means MEC's position is legally fragile, but legally fragile and operationally inconvenient are different things, and MEC has the resources to make legally fragile positions operationally inconvenient for a long time. They'll make his professional life difficult even if they can't terminate the contract, Voss said. That would be my expectation, yes, Caleb said. Zuillda, Drex said. I heard all of that, Zuillda said, and I want to say that I made my assessment of the professional consequences before I made my decision about what to file and not after, and that the assessment did not change the decision, and I want to explain why, not because I need anyone's validation, but because I think it belongs on the record alongside everything else today has put on the record. Explain it then, Drex said. I have been doing this work for 14 years, Zuillda said, moving through the last of the agricultural margins and picking up the sensor signature of his drop pod at the landing coordinates ahead of him. And in 14 years I have gone to 37 planets, and I have collected data and filed reports, and the reports have been used by companies like MEC to make decisions about those planets. And in 14 years I have not once had a reason to ask whether what I was doing with my professional skills was something I could defend on grounds other than the technical quality of the work. And today I have that reason for the first time. And the answer I arrived at when I asked the question was that I could defend the technical quality of the work, and I could not defend anything else about what I was being asked to do with it. And when you arrive at that answer, the subsequent decision is not actually a decision, it is just the logical conclusion of having done the honest accounting. Nobody said anything for a moment, and the settlement of 7 Theta 9 was a cluster of lights behind him now in the falling dark, the artificial lighting infrastructure he had noted on the building faces during the day doing its job as the natural light withdrew. And the lights had the quality that lights have in settlements everywhere, the quality of people inside structures at the end of their day, and he looked at them for a moment before he reached the drop pod and began his pre-launch sequence. Also, Zuillda said, because the moment needed something after what had preceded it, and he had something available that was true, and that was different in register from everything else he had said. I want to note that the administrator with the trespass notice is going to be filing a report to their institutional superiors tonight about the entity that was in their settlement today, and that report is going to describe, in whatever terms their institutional framework provides, something that walked through their streets and looked at their buildings and collected samples from their ground and interacted with their children and received a trespass notice with what the administrator probably interpreted as polite incomprehension. And I want to think about what that report is going to say, not because I can know, but because I think it is worth thinking about. Because that administrator is going to be telling someone official tonight that something came here and that they tried to process it through their institutional framework, and that their institutional framework did not have a category for it. And that is, in a way, the most accurate summary of today that anyone is going to produce. What do you think they'll do with it? Voss asked, with the genuine quality. I think they will do what institutional frameworks do when they encounter something that exceeds their categories, Zuillda said, completing his pre-launch sequence checks and settling into the drop pod with the particular relief of a person returning to a space that, however limited, is entirely theirs, which is that they will create a new category, and the new category will be approximate and imperfect and will not fully capture what happened today, but it will be a beginning. And beginning is what developing civilizations do. It is in some sense the definition of what they are, and the Thari are very good at it, and I think they are going to continue to be very good at it for a long time. He sealed the pod and ran his final systems check and queued his transmission package, and then he held the transmission for a moment, not because he was uncertain about sending it, but because he wanted to take one more careful look at the sentience assessment report, the whole thing from beginning to end, the way you look at something you have built before you send it out into the world, where it is going to do what it was built to do without you. The report was good. It was thorough and precise, and documented to a standard that would hold up under any review the GSA chose to apply to it, and the data in it said what the data said, and what the data said was true, and truth was the only professional standard Zuillda had ever applied to his work, and he was applying it now, and the Thari were what they were, a people on a planet going about their civilization, with all the ordinary and extraordinary things that civilizations do. And they had been what they were for long enough that they deserved to keep being it, and the report said so in the precise technical language of field assessment science. And the precise technical language of field assessment science was the most powerful tool Zuillda had, and he had used it as well as he knew how, and that was going to have to be enough. He released the transmission. The resources report went to MEC regional operations with the efficiency of a standard operational filing, and the sentience assessment report went to the Galactic Survey Authority's intake system with the same efficiency, and the pre-deployment concern notation went to MEC's compliance division and the GSA's standards office simultaneously. And all three transmissions left his queue within the same second and traveled up through the atmosphere of 7 Theta 9 toward the Meridian threshold in orbit above, and from there into the broader transmission network that connected the ship to the institutional infrastructure of the civilization Zuillda belonged to, the civilization that had built the GSA and the survey codes and the protected species register, and all the other frameworks that existed because someone, at some point, had decided that the question of what you did when you found something alive and thinking on a planet you wanted to use was a question that deserved a careful and serious answer. Transmissions sent, Zuillda said. All three, Caleb said. All three, Zuillda confirmed. The channel was quiet, and in the quiet the first automated response arrived, the GSA intake confirmation, a case number and a timestamp, and a brief automated message that said, in the formal language of institutional acknowledgement, that the sentience assessment report for the species-designated Thari, planet MEC-Catalogue 7 Theta 9, had been received and logged and assigned to the GSA's Sentience Review Division, and that all parties in the planetary acquisition record had been notified of the case opening, and that a freeze notice suspending all pending operational activities related to MEC-Catalogue 7 Theta 9 had been issued to Meridian Extraction Consolidated pending the outcome of the review, and that the original survey documentation for the planet had been flagged for methodology review by the GSA's Survey Standards Division, and that the GSA's First Contact Protocol Division had been notified, and a first contact assessment team would be assigned within 30 standard days. Zuillda read the confirmation through once and filed it in his mission documentation and initiated his launch sequence, and the drop pod lifted from the surface of 7 Theta 9 and began its ascent through the atmosphere toward the ship. And below him, the lights of the settlement were a small warm cluster in the dark of the planet, and he watched them until the cloud layer closed over them and they were gone. Caleb, said Drex, and his voice had a quality in it that Zuillda had not heard from Drex before, something between satisfaction and the kind of relief that comes after a long and difficult thing has been done. How long before MEC regional operations calls? Based on the automated GSA notification timeline, Caleb said, MEC regional operations will receive the freeze notice within approximately 4 minutes, and I would estimate that Director Prace's call to this ship will follow within 15 to 20 minutes of that. And I want to say, for the record and on the channel, that I am going to handle that call, and I am going to handle it by reading him the GSA carve-out provisions in Zuillda's contract. And I am going to do that slowly and clearly in the manner of someone who has read the provisions several times already and is confident in their content. And if Director Prace would like to have a further conversation after that, I will refer him to MEC's legal team, which is where conversations of that nature belong. Caleb, Zuillda said, from inside the ascending drop pod with the atmosphere of 7 Theta 9 streaming past his sensors on the way out of it. That is the most professionally satisfying thing you have said in the entire time I have been on this ship. Don't get used to it, Caleb said, with the voice of a man putting the procedural quality back on over the other thing like a coat, carefully and with full awareness of what he was doing. I have 23 forms to file before end of shift, and at least 9 of them are now directly attributable to your activities today, and I intend to note that in the processing time records. Note whatever you like, Zuillda said. I'll be on the ship in 20 minutes, and I am going to find the least unpleasant available beverage, and I am going to sit somewhere quiet, and I am going to write the first draft of my formal response to MEC's contract review, which I expect to receive within 48 hours, and which I intend to have prepared for before it arrives. That's optimistic, Voss said. I'd give it 36. 30, said Drex. Prace is going to be on the phone to legal before the freeze notice finishes printing. I'll split the difference with both of you, Zuillda said, and regardless of when it arrives, I will be ready for it, because I have been ready for it since approximately 40 minutes after I landed this morning. And I want to note that being ready for the consequences of doing the right thing is a significantly more comfortable position than the alternative, even if the alternative would have been professionally simpler in the short term. And I think that observation belongs on the record, alongside everything else today has produced. The Meridian threshold appeared in his forward sensors as the drop pod cleared the upper atmosphere, the ship's running lights a steady pattern against the dark, and Zuillda looked at it with the particular feeling that you have when you are returning to a place that is not home, but is the closest thing to home that is currently available, and thought that it was a better feeling than he had expected it to be, given everything. And filed that observation in the non-professional part of his awareness, where it sat alongside the children in the doorway, and the administrator with the document, and the 9 officers walking with him in the late afternoon light, all of it accumulating into something that was not yet fully formed, but that he suspected was going to have a shape he could identify when he had enough distance from the day to see it properly. Zuillda, said Voss, as the drop pod began its docking approach, and his voice had the quality it occasionally produced when Voss had been thinking about something quietly for a long time, and had arrived at the end of his thinking and wanted to say what was there. Do you think they're going to be all right, the Thari, after all of this, after the review and the first contact process, and whatever MEC does with the legal challenge? Do you think they're going to be all right in the end? Zuillda considered the question with the seriousness it deserved and watched the threshold grow in his forward sensors, and thought about the administrator and the officers and the children, and the road with the combustion drive conveyance on it that had been the first thing he had seen on the way down, the road that someone had built and maintained and used, until it was worn with the ordinary use of a community that expected to keep using it. And he thought about what the Thari had built in the time, since Fenwell and Cullen and Vale had flown past them at Warp 6, and decided there was nothing there worth slowing down for. And he thought about the sentience assessment report that was now logged in a GSA case file with a number attached to it, and a freeze notice flowing toward Meridian Extraction, consolidated with the unstoppable efficiency of an automated system, doing exactly what it was designed to do. I think, Zuillda said, as the docking clamps received the drop pod and the Meridian threshold closed around him with the sounds of a ship that had been running for a long time and knew its business, that the Thari have been building their civilization for several hundred years without any help from anyone, and that they have produced roads and glass windows and municipal administration and law enforcement training programs and children who are curious about things that should frighten them. And that a species that can do all of that while nobody is paying attention can probably manage what comes next now that someone is, and that the report I filed today is the beginning of someone paying attention in the official and documented and legally consequential way that actually matters, and that beginning is not nothing. It is in fact quite a lot, and I think they are going to be all right.
Good, said Voss. Yes, Zuillda said, and the drop pod hatch opened, and he climbed out of the exosuit for the first time in 13 hours and stood in the deployment bay in his own skin and breathed air that smelled of ship rather than industrial lubricant, which was an improvement he was not going to take for granted. And he stood there for a moment and let the day settle around him before he went to find the least unpleasant available beverage and get ready for what came next. The least unpleasant available beverage on the Meridian threshold turned out to be a synthesized grain derivative that the ship's dispensary labeled with a name that implied warmth and character, and delivered something that was technically neither, but was hot and had sufficient chemical complexity to occupy the palate while the mind was doing other things. And Zuillda sat in the small functional space adjacent to the deployment bay that served as the ship's informal common area and drank it and worked on the first draft of his contract defense document and waited for the calls to start. The first call came in 22 minutes after docking, which meant Drex had been closest with his estimate, and it was not from Director Prace. It was from MEC's chief legal officer. Zuillda looked at the identifier on his comm screen for a moment before accepting the transmission, because the chief legal officer of Meridian Extraction Consolidated was not a person who made calls to field assessors over contract disputes. The chief legal officer of Meridian Extraction Consolidated was a person who had people who made those calls, and the fact that she was calling him directly, personally. Within 22 minutes of the GSA freeze notice landing on MEC's operational systems, told him something about how the freeze notice had been received that no amount of careful corporate language was going to be able to obscure. He accepted the transmission. Assessor Zuillda, said Chief Legal Officer Marin Stoll, in a voice that had been constructed over a long career into an instrument of extraordinary precision, capable of conveying enormous force while maintaining the surface temperature of a professional courtesy call. I am calling personally because I want to have a direct conversation with you about the events of today before this situation develops any further momentum in a direction that may not serve either of our interests. And I want to be clear from the outset that this call is being made in a spirit of professional dialogue rather than in any adversarial spirit, because I think professional dialogue is what the situation calls for at this stage. Chief Legal Officer Stoll, Zuillda said, with the even professional tone he had been maintaining all day and which had not yet failed him and was not going to fail him now, I am happy to have a professional dialogue, and I want to note for the record that this call is being captured by my suit recorder's passive logging function, which I have not yet powered down following my field deployment, and that everything said in this conversation will therefore be part of my mission documentation. And I want you to be aware of that before you say anything you might prefer to have said in a different context. There was a pause that was very brief and very controlled, the pause of a person who has been surprised and has decided not to show it and has almost succeeded. I appreciate the disclosure, Stoll said, and her voice had recalibrated over the pause in the way of someone who has adjusted their approach in real time and whose new approach is going to be even more careful than the original one. And in light of it, I want to be especially precise about what I am calling to say, which is this. MEC has received the GSA freeze notice, and MEC's legal team has reviewed the GSA intake confirmation for your sentience assessment filing, and we have also reviewed the methodology assessment component of your concern notation, and I want to tell you that our review of those documents has produced some findings that I think you will find significant. I'm listening, Zuillda said, and put down the synthesized grain derivative because the conversation deserved his full attention. Our review of your sentience assessment report, Stoll said, has confirmed that the report is thorough, professionally executed, and filed in compliance with all applicable GSA requirements. And I want to say that clearly because I think it is important that MEC's position be understood as one that respects the quality and integrity of your field work. And I also want to say clearly that our review of your methodology assessment of the original survey documentation has produced findings that are, from MEC's legal perspective, significant in ways that I did not fully anticipate when I began the review this evening. What findings? Zuillda said. The findings, Stoll said, with the careful delivery of someone who has practiced this sentence, are that your methodology assessment is correct, that the original survey documentation for 7 Theta 9 does not meet the GSA standards that were in effect at the time of its filing, that the survey team's approach was inconsistent with those standards in ways that are clearly and thoroughly documented in your concern notation, and that MEC's acquisition of this asset was therefore built on a foundation that MEC's own legal team cannot defend to the standard
that the GSA review process is going to require. And I am telling you this because I believe you already know it, and because I think honesty at this stage serves MEC's broader interests better than the alternative. Zuillda looked at the comm screen for a moment, and then at the bulkhead behind it, and then at the synthesized grain derivative sitting on the table, and thought about the shape of what he was hearing and what it implied. Because chief legal officers of major extraction companies did not call field assessors to confirm that the field assessors were right about everything, unless the chief legal officer had done a complete accounting of their position and decided that a different strategy was required. And that strategy was not something that emerged in 22 minutes from a standing start, which meant Stoll had been doing this accounting before the freeze notice landed, which meant MEC had known the survey was problematic before today. Chief Legal Officer Stoll, Zuillda said, slowly and precisely, I want to ask you a question, and I want to be direct about why I am asking it, which is that the speed of your review and the completeness of your findings suggest that some of the analysis you are describing was not done tonight but was done earlier, and possibly done before my deployment this morning. And I want to ask whether MEC's legal team had reviewed the 7 Theta 9 survey documentation prior to today, and had identified the methodology issues I describe in my concern notation before I filed that notation. The pause before Stoll's answer was the longest pause of the day, longer than Caleb's pauses, longer than Prace's pauses, the pause of a person making a final decision about how far in a particular direction they are willing to go. MEC's legal team, Stoll said, with the precision of someone choosing every word as if each one is load-bearing, conducted a routine pre-activation legal review of the 7 Theta 9 acquisition documentation approximately 8 months ago, in preparation for the current operational phase. And that review identified certain methodological questions about the original survey documentation that were noted internally, and that formed part of the background context for the legal team's analysis of the operational risk picture when your biological findings were received today. The common area was very quiet. You knew, Zuillda said, not with anger, because anger was not what he felt. He felt something more like the sensation of a picture coming into complete focus after spending a day looking at its component pieces, that the survey was methodologically inadequate, and you proceeded with the operational activation anyway. And when my biological findings came in today, the legal team's response was shaped by 8 months of prior awareness of the survey's vulnerability rather than by a fresh assessment of my report. I want to be careful about characterizations, Stoll said. I want to be careful about them too, Zuillda said, which is why I am not going to characterize what you have just told me as anything other than what it is, which is a material fact that I am going to include in my mission documentation as an addendum to my concern notation, specifically as item 35. And I want to note that item 35 is going to be the most significant item in the notation, and that it is going to be filed with the GSA Standards Office as part of the existing case record, and I think your legal team needs to understand that before this conversation goes any further. Another pause different from the one before, the quality of a recalculation rather than a decision. Zuillda, Stoll said, and her voice had arrived somewhere new, shed the careful constructed quality entirely, speaking in the register of a person who has run out of constructed registers and is working directly now. I am going to tell you something that I want you to receive as genuinely as I am able to offer it. Which is that I have been MEC's chief legal officer for 11 years, and in 11 years I have managed a great many difficult situations, and I have developed a reasonably accurate sense of when a situation has passed the point where management is the appropriate approach, and has become a situation where the appropriate approach is something else, and this situation passed that point today. And the reason I called you personally tonight, rather than routing this through operational channels, is that I wanted to have a conversation with the person whose professional work produced the documentation that moved the situation past that point, because that person matters to what happens next. What do you want to happen next? Zuillda said. I want MEC to get ahead of this, Stoll said, with the directness of someone who has decided that directness is the only tool left that might work, not in the defensive and reactive way that Prace's communication represented, but in the way that a company gets ahead of something when it has the honesty to recognize that its position is not defensible, and the judgment to understand that the question is no longer whether to defend the position, but how to move from the position to something that is defensible. And I think the something that is defensible, in this case, involves MEC taking a different approach to the 7 Theta 9 situation than the one that Prace authorized this afternoon.
Define different, Zuillda said. Different means MEC working cooperatively with the GSA review process rather than against it, Stoll said. Different means MEC acknowledging the survey methodology failure rather than defending the documentation. Different means MEC engaging with the question of what the appropriate relationship between a resource extraction company and a protected developing civilization looks like when the company arrived at the situation through a process that was flawed from the beginning. And I want to be honest that some version of different also means MEC's board making calculations about long-term liability, exposure versus short-term resource access, and arriving at a position that reflects those calculations rather than the position that Prace articulated this afternoon. But I think the calculation and the right answer point in the same direction in this case, which is not always true and which I think matters. You're describing MEC withdrawing from the extraction plan, Zuillda said. I'm describing MEC reconsidering the extraction plan in light of a complete and honest assessment of its legal, regulatory, and reputational foundations, Stoll said, which is a different thing from withdrawing, and the difference matters both legally and practically, but the practical outcome of that reconsideration is likely to be something that looks considerably different from what Prace authorized this afternoon, yes. Zuillda sat with this for a moment, turning it over with the same careful attention he gave to geological data, looking at its composition and its structure, and what it implied about the larger formation it was part of, and what it implied was complicated and not entirely comfortable, because Stoll was telling him something genuine, but she was also telling him something that served MEC's interests in a specific way, and those two things were not mutually exclusive, but they were not the same thing. And he wanted to understand both before he responded to either. Chief Legal Officer Stoll, he said, I want to ask you about the other planets. There was a silence with a completely new quality to it, a silence that had not been expecting that specific sentence, and in the silence, Zuillda continued. My concern notations item 34 addresses the systematic relationship between the original survey's methodological failures and my operational conditions today, he said, and in preparing that item, I reviewed the operational history of Harvard Survey Associates and the portfolio of surveys they conducted for MEC before MEC acquired and dissolved them. And I found that the 7 Theta 9 survey was not the only Harvard survey in MEC's acquisition portfolio that relied primarily or exclusively on rapid transit orbital passes for its biological classification data, and I want to know whether MEC's pre-activation legal review 8 months ago looked at those other surveys or exclusively at 7 Theta 9. The silence extended. How many did you identify? Stoll said very quietly. 11 surveys in MEC's active acquisition portfolio that share the methodological profile of the 7 Theta 9 survey, Zuillda said, meaning single or limited orbital passes as the primary biological classification methodology, survey windows of 2 to 4 days for Class M planetary bodies, and biological assessment sections that are materially shorter and less supported than the geological sections in the same documents. And I want to be clear that I have not had the opportunity to conduct surface assessments of those 11 planets, so I cannot tell you what is on them, but I can tell you that the methodology used to classify them is the same methodology that produced a sub-sentient classification for a planet with 1 billion people on it. And I think that is a fact that MEC's board needs to be working from when they make their calculations about long-term liability exposure. What followed was the longest silence of the entire day, longer than anything the channel had produced, longer than Caleb's careful pauses and Prace's recalibrating ones and Stoll's decision-making ones, a silence with the quality of a very large and very solid thing shifting its weight. 11 planets, Stoll said. 11 in the active acquisition portfolio, Zuillda said, and I have not reviewed the historical portfolio of planets that Harvard surveyed before MEC began its acquisition activation program, and I don't know how many surveys in that historical portfolio share the same profile, and I think that is a number that MEC's legal team needs to determine with some urgency. I need to make some calls, Stoll said. I imagine you do, Zuillda said, and I want to say before you make them that my concern notation as filed covers the 7 Theta 9 situation specifically and the methodological questions about the Harvard survey portfolio generally, and that I have flagged the 11 planet issue as an item requiring further investigation, and that I have filed the notation with the GSA Standards Office as part of the existing case record. And that the GSA Standards Office is therefore already in possession of the 11 planet flag and will presumably be conducting their own review of the Harvard portfolio as part of the case investigation. Of course they will, Stoll said,
with the tone of a person watching a situation reveal dimensions they had not previously mapped. "I want to say one more thing," Zuillda said, "and I want to say it clearly and without any professional packaging, because I think this conversation has arrived at a point where professional packaging is not serving either of us."
"Say it," Stoll said.
"The Thari are a people," Zuillda said, "and what they deserve from this situation is not to be a line item in a liability assessment, even a liability assessment that arrives at the correct practical conclusion. And I understand that MEC is a company, and that companies operate through calculations, and I am not asking MEC to stop being a company or to stop making calculations. I am asking that the calculation that gets made here is a complete one. One that has the Thari's status as a protected developing civilization, as a fixed point rather than as a variable, and that everything else is arranged around that fixed point rather than the other way around. And I think if you make that calculation honestly, the answer that comes out of it is defensible in every sense of that word, legally and professionally, and in the other sense that doesn't have a professional name, but that everyone in this conversation understands perfectly well." Stoll was quiet for a long moment, and then she said, in a voice that had come the furthest from its original register of anything that had been said tonight, "I'll be in touch," and ended the transmission. Zuillda sat in the common area and picked up the synthesized grain derivative, and found it had gone cold, and drank it anyway, and added item 35 to his concern notation, and filed the addendum with the GSA Standards Office, and then sat quietly for a moment in the particular way of someone who has done the thing they set out to do, and is sitting in the space between the doing and whatever comes next. Drex appeared in the doorway of the common area. He had the look of a person who had been listening to everything, and had been standing in the corridor outside the common area for the last part of it, which Zuillda had been aware of from the acoustic signature of his presence, and had not commented on because there was no reason to comment on it.
11 planets, Drex said.
11 in the active portfolio, Zuillda said. I don't know the full number yet. Neither does MEC, apparently, Drex said, and came into the common area and sat down across from Zuillda with the manner of someone who has decided to be somewhere rather than finding himself there, a quality Drex had not previously deployed in Zuillda's presence. They knew about the methodology problem on this one, Zuillda said, and they proceeded anyway, and I think they knew that pulling the thread on one survey risked pulling the thread on all of them, and I think that was part of why Prace's communication was written the way it was written, trying to move past the immediate situation before anyone started looking at the broader pattern. And you looked at the broader pattern, Drex said. I read the survey documentation carefully, Zuillda said, and when you read something carefully enough you see the shape of it, and the shape of the 7 Theta 9 survey was a shape I recognized, and when I recognized it I looked for other surveys with the same shape, and there were 11, and I filed what I found because it was part of the complete picture, and I was filing a complete picture. You didn't mention the 11 planets on the channel today, Drex said, not accusingly, observationally. I was still confirming the count when I was preparing my transmissions, Zuillda said, and I wanted to be certain before I put a number on the record, and I am now certain, and the number is on the record, and Stoll is making calls, and I think those calls are going to produce a set of subsequent calls that are going to keep MEC's legal department occupied for a considerable period of time. How long, Drex said. Years, Zuillda said. The GSA review process for a sentience finding of this complexity takes years at minimum, and if the Standards Office opens a portfolio review of the Harvard surveys, the scope of that investigation is going to be very large and very thorough, because the GSA does not do partial investigations when the pattern of potential violations is systemic, and 11 planets is a systemic pattern. Voss appeared in the doorway behind Drex, with the quality of someone who had also been in the corridor, and had decided that whatever Drex was doing was worth joining.
What happens to MEC? Voss said.
MEC is a large company with substantial resources and a legal team that is clearly capable and clearly motivated, Zuillda said, and I don't think MEC ceases to exist. Companies of this size have survived significant regulatory challenges before, but I think MEC's acquisition portfolio is going to look very different in 5 years than it does today. And I think the people who made decisions about the Harvard surveys and about what to do with the methodology questions when they were identified internally are going to have significant professional difficulties, and I think the board is going to make the calculation that Stoll described, and that calculation is going to point toward cooperation with the GSA process rather than resistance to it. Because resistance to a systemic investigation of this scope is not a position that a publicly registered extraction company can maintain without consequences that exceed the value of what they are trying to protect. And the Thari, Voss said. The Thari, Zuillda said, are going to have a first contact assessment team assigned within 30 days, and the first contact process for a civilization at their developmental stage is a careful and gradual one that is designed to introduce the existence of broader galactic civilization without destabilizing the developing civilization's own trajectory, and the people who do that work are specialists and they are good at it. And the Thari are going to be fine, because the Thari have been building something worth being fine about for several hundred years, and one survey error and one extraction company's overreach is not enough to undo that. What about you? Drex said. Zuillda considered this question with the same care he had given the others, and found that the answer was more straightforward than he had expected it to be, which itself was something he noted with a certain quality of surprise, because he had been expecting the answer to require more examination than it did. MEC is going to initiate a contract review, he said, and the contract review is going to find what Caleb predicted it would find, which is that the GSA carve-out provisions protect my filing, and the mandatory reporting obligation protects my methodology assessment, and the accurate and complete resources report I filed gives MEC no legitimate grounds to claim I failed my primary professional obligation. And the review is going to close without termination, because the legal basis for termination is not there, and Stoll knows it is not there. And I think after tonight Stoll is going to be significantly more interested in a relationship with me that is cooperative rather than adversarial. Because of the 11 planets, Drex said. Because of the 11 planets, Zuillda confirmed, and because a field assessor who finds things carefully and documents them thoroughly and files them accurately is an asset to a company that is about to go through a very thorough external review of its survey portfolio, if that assessor is working for the company rather than against it, and I think Stoll is smart enough to understand that dynamic and to act on it. She's going to offer you a job, Voss said, with the delighted disbelief of someone watching something unfold that they had not anticipated. She's going to offer me something, Zuillda said, and I am going to consider it carefully and negotiate thoroughly and accept terms that include specific provisions about professional autonomy and GSA filing obligations, and the right to conduct assessments to the full standard regardless of operational timelines, and those provisions are going to be in writing and signed by the chief legal officer personally, and then I am going to continue doing my job to the standard I have always done it. Which is the standard that produced today's results, and I think that is a satisfactory outcome given where the day started. Drex looked at him for a moment with an expression that Zuillda's behavioral analysis software, had it been running, would have categorized as something between respect and the specific discomfort of a person revising an assessment they had held for a while and are not entirely comfortable finding they need to revise. When you came on this ship, Drex said, I want you to know that my initial assessment of you was not generous, and I want to be honest about the reasons for that, which were not entirely professional, because Prek was someone we had worked with for 3 years, and we did not handle losing him from the crew with particular grace, and you arrived in a way that felt like a substitution rather than an addition, and we treated you accordingly. And I am telling you this because I think you probably knew it, and because I think it deserves to be said out loud, rather than left as a thing we all know and nobody mentions. I knew it, Zuillda said. I figured, Drex said. I'm saying it anyway. I know, Zuillda said, and there was in his voice the quality of someone receiving something that costs the person giving it something, and receiving it with the respect that cost deserves. Also, Drex said, and the ease came back into his voice, the genuine version of it, the version that was not performance but was actually how Drex moved through the world when he was not protecting something. I want to say that the image of you in that suit, walking through that settlement all day with 15 officers following you, and an administrator waving documents at you, and geological sample readings running the whole time, is something I am going to be describing to people for the rest of my professional career, and I want you to know that, when I describe it, I am going to describe it accurately, which means I am going to describe it as the most ridiculous and also the most impressive thing I have ever watched a field assessor do. You can describe it however you like, Zuillda said, as long as you include the part about the Warp 6 flyby, because I want that part in every version of the story. The Warp 6 flyby is the best part, Voss said from the doorway, with complete conviction. The Warp 6 flyby is going to be the first thing I tell people and the last thing I tell people, and I am going to tell it until people stop being surprised by it, which I estimate will be never. Caleb appeared behind Voss in the doorway, which meant the entire complement of the Meridian Threshold's crew was now standing in or adjacent to the common area, something that Zuillda suspected had not happened in the ordinary course of this ship's operations with any regularity, and Caleb was holding a data tablet and looking at it with the expression of a person reading something they expected and had prepared for and are finding now that it has arrived. That preparation and arrival are different experiences. "Praise called," Caleb said, without looking up from the tablet. "I'm not surprised," Zuillda said. "He was, as anticipated, not pleased," Caleb said, "and I read him the GSA carve-out provisions in your contract, as I indicated I would, and he said several things that I am not going to repeat on the channel record, and one thing that I am going to repeat, which is that he said, and I want to be precise about this, that this situation is not finished, and that MEC intends to pursue every available avenue to protect its operational position on this asset." "That's a fairly standard response," Zuillda said. "It was," Caleb agreed, and then I received a second call, 12 minutes after Prace's, from someone whose identifier I did not recognize, and the call was from a senior analyst in MEC's acquisitions division, and the analyst told me, voluntarily and without prompting, that they had been trying for 4 months to get someone in MEC's senior operational leadership to take seriously the methodology questions that the pre-activation legal review had raised about the 7 Theta 9 survey, and that they had filed 3 internal memos on the subject that had been acknowledged and not acted on, and that they were calling because they wanted to offer their cooperation to any review process that was going to examine the situation. And they provided me with copies of the 3 internal memos. The common area was completely quiet. "They have the memos," Voss said. "They have the memos," Caleb confirmed, "and the memos are detailed and they are signed and they are timestamped, and they describe the methodology questions with a clarity and a specificity that makes it entirely clear that MEC's senior operational leadership had documented professional advice that the 7 Theta 9 survey was inadequate and proceeded with the operational activation anyway, and I have forwarded the memos to Zuillda's mission documentation file, and I have also, on my own professional judgment, forwarded them to the GSA case file as supplementary evidence, because I am this ship's mission coordinator, and the mission coordinator's responsibility includes ensuring that all material evidence relevant to an active GSA case is properly submitted, and I am confident that this falls within that responsibility." "Caleb," Zuillda said. "I have 26 forms to file before end of shift," Caleb said, still looking at the tablet, "and I don't want to discuss it further." "I want to discuss it briefly," Zuillda said, "because what you just did is not a small thing and it deserves acknowledgement, and the acknowledgement I want to give it is this. You are a considerably better mission coordinator than this ship's atmosphere has given you room to be, and I think that is a fact that deserves to be on the record alongside everything else today has put there." Caleb looked up from the tablet for the first time, and the expression on his face had the quality of a person receiving something they were not expecting and are not entirely sure what to do with, and he looked at it for a moment and then looked back at the tablet. 26 forms, he said. 26 forms, Zuillda agreed, and let him go. The 4 of them stayed in the common area for a while after that, in the comfortable way that people stay somewhere when the thing they have been doing together is finished, and nobody is quite ready to go back to whatever comes before and after it, and Drex told a version of the exosuit story that was already substantially better than the events had been, and Voss contributed details that improved it further, and Caleb, from somewhere in the corridor where his forms were presumably filing themselves, occasionally called out corrections to the timeline that demonstrated he had been paying significantly more attention to the events of the day than his procedural manner had suggested. Zuillda sat in the common area of the Meridian Threshold and drank cold synthesized grain derivative and listened to the story of his own day being told back to him with the embellishments that good stories acquire in the first hours of their existence, and thought about 7 Theta 9 below them with its lights and its roads and its officers going home at the end of their shift, and its administrator writing a report that had no adequate category for what it needed to describe. And thought about the GSA case file building itself in an automated system somewhere with his sentience assessment and Caleb's memos and the flagged Harvin portfolio, all accumulating into the official and documented and legally consequential record that was going to determine what happened next. And thought about 11 planets whose surveys he had not yet read and whose surfaces he had not yet seen, and whose status was now a question with a case number attached to it and a standards office review pending. His comm screen signaled an incoming transmission. The identifier read, Stole M. Chief Legal Officer, Meridian Extraction Consolidated. He looked at it for a moment, and Drex, who had been watching, said, "That was fast," in a voice of pure appreciation, and Voss said, "I told you," in a voice of complete vindication, and from the corridor Caleb said nothing, but the sound of his form filing paused briefly and then resumed. Zuillda accepted the transmission. "Chief Legal Officer Stoll," he said. "Assessor Zuillda," said Stoll, and her voice had the quality of someone who has made a complete set of calls and arrived at a position, and is now speaking from that position with the clarity of a person who knows where they stand. "I have spoken with MEC's board chair, and with the chair of MEC's audit committee, and with 3 members of the senior acquisitions leadership. And I have shared the contents of our earlier conversation and the material that your mission coordinator submitted to the GSA case file this evening, and I want to tell you the outcomes of those conversations." "Go ahead," Zuillda said. "The board has authorized a voluntary cooperation protocol with the GSA review process, which means MEC will be providing full access to the Harvin survey portfolio and all internal documentation related to the pre-activation legal reviews of those surveys, including the documentation related to the advice that was not acted on," Stoll said. "And the board has also authorized me to open conversations with the GSA's Acquisitions Oversight Division about a negotiated resolution framework for the 7 Theta 9 situation specifically and the Harvin portfolio situation generally, and that framework is going to be built around the principle that MEC's relationship with any planet found to support protected species will be governed by the species status and not by MEC's prior acquisition documentation. Which is a significant position change, and I want you to understand that it is a genuine one rather than a tactical one." "I appreciate that," Zuillda said, and meant it. "I also want to tell you," Stoll said, "that Director Prace has been relieved of his operational responsibilities pending the board's review of the decisions made today, and that the 3 members of senior acquisitions leadership who were provided the internal memos regarding the 7 Theta 9 survey methodology and did not act on them are also under board review. And I want to be honest that this is partly because it is the right thing and partly because it is the necessary thing, and those 2 things have the same practical outcome in this case, even if their justifications are different." "I understand the difference," Zuillda said, "and I agree that it matters less than the outcome when the outcome is the right one." Finally, Stoll said, "I want to make you an offer, and I want to make it straightforwardly rather than through the normal channels, because I think the normal channels are going to be slower than the situation warrants, and the offer is this. MEC needs a qualified field assessor with a demonstrated commitment to complete and accurate assessment work to lead the portfolio review of the 11 Harvin surveys you identified, and potentially additional surveys if the Standards Office review expands the scope. And I want to offer you that role with a contract that includes the professional autonomy provisions and the GSA filing protections and the assessment standard guarantees that I think you are going to tell me are your conditions. Because I think you are going to tell me those are your conditions." "Those are my conditions," Zuillda said. "I assumed they were," Stoll said. "Do we have the basis for a conversation?" "We have the basis for a conversation," Zuillda said, "and I want to note that the conversation is going to be a thorough one, and that the conditions are going to be specific and detailed, and in writing, and that I intend to have them reviewed by an independent legal advisor before I sign anything. And I think if you are as serious about the cooperation protocol as you say you are, those requirements are going to present no difficulty." "No difficulty," Stoll confirmed. "Then we have the basis for a conversation," Zuillda said, "and I am available tomorrow after I have slept, because today has been a long day and I have earned a night's rest, and I intend to take it." "Tomorrow," Stoll said, and there was in her voice something that was not quite warmth but was adjacent to it, the tone of a person who has found a thing they needed where they did not expect to find it, and is allowing themselves a moment of genuine acknowledgement of that fact before the professional apparatus closes back over it. "And Zuillda, for what it is worth, and I want to be clear that I am saying this as an individual rather than as chief legal officer. The work you did today was the kind of work that the assessment profession is supposed to produce and rarely does, and the fact that it produced consequences that MEC did not want does not change the fact that it was exactly the kind of work the assessment profession needs more of." "Thank you," Zuillda said, and let her go. The common area was quiet for a moment after the transmission ended, and then Drex said, in a voice of pure and unmanufactured wonder, "She offered you a job." "She offered me a conversation about a job," Zuillda said. "Which you are going to take," Voss said. "Which I am going to consider thoroughly and negotiate carefully and potentially, except on terms that reflect the complete scope of what today demonstrated about my professional value," Zuillda said, "which is a different thing from taking it, and the difference matters to me." "It's the same thing," Drek said. "It really is," Voss said. Zuillda considered arguing the point and decided against it, because it was late and the synthesized grain derivative was cold, and the day had been very long and some arguments were better won by silence than by speech. And he sat in the common area of the Meridian threshold, while the ship held its orbit above 7 Theta 9, and thought about 11 planets he had not yet seen in surveys, he had not yet read, and a first contact team that would be assigned within 30 days to begin the careful and gradual work of introducing a civilization to the fact that it was not alone, and thought about the administrator's report, still being written somewhere below, still searching for the category that did not yet, and thought that creating the category that did not yet exist was in some ways the most important work that any civilization ever did, the work of making room in your understanding for something you had not previously known how to include, and that the Thari were going to be very good at it, because they had already demonstrated today. In the way they managed the unmanageable and processed the unprocessable, and sent their administrator out with documents into the unknown, with the specific bravery of people who believe in their institutions, enough to deploy them against things their institutions were never designed for, that they were the kind of people who made room. He finished the cold, synthesized grain derivative, and put the cup down and stood up and looked at Drex and Voss in the doorway. "I'm going to sleep," he said. "You've earned it," Drex said, in the voice he used when he meant something entirely. "Also," Voss said, "for what it's worth, and I know it's late and probably not the moment, I want to say that I'm glad it was you on the list and not someone else, because someone else might have just done the geological report and come home, and I think that would have been wrong in a way that I wouldn't have known how to articulate before today, but that I can articulate now, which is that it would have been wrong in the way that all the things that look like they don't have consequences are actually wrong." Quietly and completely, and without anyone noticing, until someone finally looks carefully at a survey that nobody has looked at carefully in 41 years. Zuillda looked at Voss for a moment, and Voss looked back with the specific expression of someone who has said something true and is standing behind it. "Get some sleep, Voss," Zuillda said. "Yeah," said Voss. He walked down the corridor of the Meridian threshold toward his berth, past the deployment bay where the exosuit was racked in its storage position with its hydraulic joints locked, and its sensor cluster pointing at the ceiling, and its smell of industrial lubricant permeating the immediate atmosphere in the way it had been permeating atmospheres since long before Zuillda had climbed into it this morning, and he stopped and looked at it for a moment. It was, objectively, a terrible suit. It was the wrong suit for the wrong planet, deployed on the basis of the wrong survey, by people who had not thought carefully about any of the decisions involved in putting it together, and it had made his day significantly harder in ways that he had documented thoroughly in 34 of his 35 concern notation items. And he was going to submit that notation, and the documentation was going to stand, and the people responsible for the decisions were going to answer for them in whatever forums their accountability required. It had also, he reflected, been the thing he was wearing when he walked into a settlement on a planet nobody had bothered to look at carefully in 41 years, and had found something there that deserved to be found, and had found it in a way that was now in a GSA case file with a number attached to it, and a first contact team pending, and a freeze notice sitting on MEC's operational desk, and 11 more planets waiting for someone to look at them carefully. He filed one final addition to his mission documentation, a personal note in the assessor's log rather than in any of the formal report sections, a section of the documentation that was not transmitted anywhere and existed only in his own mission record, and the note said simply, "The suit was wrong for the planet, and the planet was right for the suit," which is a sentence that does not make professional sense and makes complete sense in every other way, and today was a long day and tomorrow is going to be longer, and the work is not done but it is begun, and beginning is enough. He powered down his suit recorder, finally, after 13 hours and 47 minutes of continuous operation, and went to bed, and the Meridian threshold held its orbit above 7 Theta 9, and below them the lights of the settlement went about the ordinary extraordinary business of being alive, exactly as they had been doing for several hundred years, exactly as they were going to keep doing for several hundred more.
Thanks so much for listening. If you enjoyed today's episode, please consider subscribing so you never miss a story. And if you want to support the show, leaving a review on your Favorite podcast app really helps us grow. See you next time.